leather jacket that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had survived the German occupation of New Orleans by learning to recognize predators in human clothing. Iris was reading Faulkner's Sanctuary, finding in his tortured prose a reflection of her own complicated relationship with the South. Her parents expected her to return home after graduation, to marry well and manage charity galas, but Iris harbored dreams of literary magazines and small presses in cities where her family name meant nothing. Beside her, Ned Gutierrez sorted through cassette tapes with the solemnity of someone curating his own identity. Music was his language, his refuge from the weight of being the first in his family to attend university. His parents' restaurant in San Antonio had funded his education one plate at a time, and every weekend away felt both like a celebration and a small betrayal of their sacrifice. The Honda crested a small hill, and Damon eased off the accelerator. Ahead, perhaps 200 yards down the slope, a figure stood at the roadside. Even at this distance, they could see something fundamentally wrong in the woman's posture. The way she swayed as though fighting to remain upright. The desperate quality of her gestures that spoke of someone whose understanding of the world had been violently revised. "Someone's having car trouble," Wesley observed, though they could see no disabled vehicle anywhere along the empty stretch of highway. As they drew closer, details emerged with disturbing clarity. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, her blonde hair matted with substances that might have been mud, sweat, or worse. She wore a Georgetown University sweatshirt that had once been white, but now bore stains that told a story none of them wanted to read. Her jeans were torn at both knees, and her feet were bare despite the October chill that was making their breath visible in the car's interior. Most unsettling were her eyes. Even through the windshield, they could see the wild, desperate quality of someone who had witnessed something that fundamentally altered her relationship with reality. She raised both hands as the Honda approached, not waving, but pressing her palms forward in a gesture that seemed equal parts plea and warning, the universal sign of someone trying to stop an approaching disaster. Damon slowed the car to a crawl, every instinct he possessed screaming contradictory instructions. His upbringing had taught him to help those in need. The privilege carried responsibility. But something deeper, more primitive, was urging him to accelerate past this broken figure and whatever catastrophe had created her. "Jesus Christ, what happened to her?" he murmured, more to himself than his passengers. "Keep driving," Ned said immediately. Something in the woman's appearance triggering an alarm that bypassed rational thought entirely. Whatever her problem is, it's not our problem. But Wesley was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his medical training overriding caution. He had spent 2 summers volunteering in emergency rooms, had seen what violence and trauma could do to the human body. "Look at her. She's hurt. We can't just leave her here." "We absolutely can," Ned insisted, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by growing up in neighborhoods where the wrong choice could be fatal. This is exactly how people end up on the evening news. 4 college students found dead after stopping to help stranger. Iris leaned forward from her position behind Damon, studying the woman with the analytical gaze she usually reserved for literature. "She looks terrified," she said quietly. "What if someone's chasing her? What if she escaped from something?" The question hung in the car's interior like smoke, coloring everything that followed, because that was the thing about evil. It understood human psychology well enough to weaponize compassion, to turn the very qualities that elevated humans above mere animals into the mechanisms of their destruction. Damon brought the car to a complete stop, leaving the engine running. Through the windshield, they watched the woman approach with unsteady steps, her mouth moving constantly, though they couldn't yet hear her words. Her hands shook visibly, and she kept glancing over her shoulder at the tree line behind her with the paranoid vigilance of prey that knows it's still being hunted. Wesley rolled down his window as the woman reached the passenger side. Up close, her condition was even more alarming. Scratches covered her exposed arms and face, some fresh enough to still weep small amounts of blood. Her fingernails were broken and caked with dirt, as though she had clawed her way through dense undergrowth. The smell that emanated from her was complex and disturbing. Sweat, fear, and something else that spoke of places where civilized rules no longer applied. "Please," she said, and her voice carried the hoarse quality of someone who had been screaming until her vocal cords began to fail. "Please, you have to turn around. You can't go up there. He's still out here, and he's waiting." Wesley studied her with clinical attention, noting the dilated pupils, the rapid pulse visible in her neck, the way she favored her left foot. These were real injuries, real trauma responses. But trauma from what? "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need us to take you to a hospital?" No. She grabbed the car door with both hands, her knuckles white with desperation. "You don't understand. The woods. Something in the woods. My friends." Her voice broke, and she began to sob with the harsh, ugly sound of someone who had already cried until nothing remained but raw grief. The four friends exchanged glances heavy with unspoken communication. They were intelligent, educated, raised to believe that problems could be solved through proper channels and reasonable action. But intelligence could be a liability when confronted with something that operated outside the boundaries of civilized understanding. "Get in the car," Wesley said, making the decision for all of them. "We'll get you help." Ned started to protest, but Iris was already moving to make room in the back seat. "She needs medical attention," Iris said, though something in her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as the others. The woman climbed into the back seat with Wesley's assistance, immediately filling the small space with her complex odor and an almost palpable aura of trauma. She continued to mutter under her breath, fragments about friends and warnings and something that lived in the deep woods where the old-growth trees blocked out the sun and normal rules ceased to function. "What's your name?" Wesley asked gently as Damon resumed driving, though more slowly now, as though the woman's presence had infected them all with her urgent need for caution. "Katie? Katie Brennan? We came up here for the weekend, just like you." She looked around the car's interior, taking in their weekend bags, their easy camaraderie, the cassette tapes scattered on the floor. Her gaze lingered on each detail with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize the last moments before everything changed forever. "Georgetown, senior year. We thought we were so smart." The words hung in the air like an accusation, because that was exactly what they thought, that their education, their privilege, their careful planning could protect them from the kind of primitive dangers that claimed less fortunate people. They had never considered that intelligence might actually make them better prey, that a predator might prefer victims who could appreciate the full scope of their helplessness. "What happened to your friends?" Iris asked, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Katie's response was immediate and visceral. She began rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso in a self-protective gesture that spoke of someone whose basic trust in the world had been systematically destroyed. Gone. All gone. Melissa, Jessica, Brian. He took them one by one, and I hid. I hid like a coward while they screamed. The car fell silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt and Katie's irregular breathing. Each of the four friends processed this information differently. Wesley with clinical detachment, trying to diagnose whether they were dealing with trauma-induced psychosis or genuine danger. Iris with literary fascination, recognizing the archetypal quality of Katie's story while struggling to believe it could be literally true. Ned with growing alarm, his street-honed instincts screaming that they had made a terrible mistake, and Damon with the irritation of someone whose perfect weekend was being complicated by someone else's drama. "Who took them?" Wesley pressed, his medical training demanding specifics. "Was it someone you knew?" "He lives in the woods. He's been there for years, maybe decades. The locals know, but they don't talk about it. They just stay away from certain areas, certain cabins." Katie suddenly gripped Wesley's shoulder with surprising strength. "What cabin are you going to? Whose place?" "A family friend," Damon said carefully, suddenly reluctant to provide details. "Guy named Crenshaw." The effect on Katie was immediate and catastrophic. She began screaming. Not the dramatic scream of someone seeking attention, but the raw, primal sound of an animal caught in a trap. It was so unexpected, so genuinely terrifying, that Damon swerved slightly before regaining control of the vehicle. No, that's where we were staying. That's his hunting ground. You have to turn around right now." "Jesus, calm down," Damon snapped, his own nerves fraying as Katie's panic threatened to infect them all. "You're going to get us all killed." But Katie was beyond calm, beyond reason, beyond anything except the desperate need to prevent these four strangers from walking into the same trap that had consumed her friends. She lunged forward, grasping at the steering wheel with both hands while making incoherent sounds of desperation. The Honda swerved again, more dramatically this time, and Damon had to fight for control as Katie continued to grab at the wheel. Wesley tried to restrain her from behind, but she was possessed by a strength born of absolute terror, the kind of strength that emerges when the alternative to action is certain death. "Let me out," she demanded when she couldn't reach the wheel. "Let me out right here." "I won't go back there. I can't." Damon pulled over to the shoulder, his hands shaking with adrenaline and suppressed rage. "Look, lady, I don't know what happened to you, but you need to get your shit together. We're trying to help." "Then turn around," Katie pleaded, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more unsettling than her screaming had been. "Please. He's probably already seen this car. He knows you're coming. That's how he works. He knows everything that happens in his territory." The statement carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume, because there was something in Katie's tone, not the rambling quality of delusion, but the flat certainty of someone reporting facts that she had verified through experience more terrible than any of them could imagine. Iris leaned forward from her position behind Damon. "What does he look like? This person you're afraid of?" Katie was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Big, maybe 6.5 feet tall, thin but strong. He moves through the woods like he grew up there, like he's part of them. His hair is long, gray, tied back. But his eyes..." She shuddered. "His eyes are wrong, like he's looked at things the rest of us aren't supposed to see. Like he's done things that changed him into something that just looks human." "You said he took your friends," Wesley said carefully, his clinical training demanding precision even as his instincts screamed warnings he was trying to ignore. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Katie's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the hyperventilation of someone reliving trauma. "He hunts people. Not for food, not for money, for the experience. He studies them first, watches them, learns their patterns. Then he takes them one by one, slowly, so the others know what's coming." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, as though the act of explaining gave her some measure of control over the uncontrollable. Melissa was first. She went out to get firewood Friday evening and never came back. We found her jacket hanging from a tree branch the next morning, torn and bloody, like something had been feeding on whatever was inside it. The Honda's interior had grown suffocating, thick with the smell of Katie's fear sweat and the weight of her story. None of the four friends spoke, but each was privately calculating the distance to the nearest town, the quickest route home, the possibility that they were sharing a confined space with someone whose grip on reality had been permanently severed by whatever had happened to her in those woods. Jessica was next, Katie continued, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone who had repeated the story to herself so many times that it had become divorced from emotion. She was taking a shower Saturday evening, and we heard her screaming. By the time Brian and I got to the bathroom, she was gone. Window was open, screen cut clean through with something sharp. No footprints, no disturbance in the ground outside, like she had just vanished into the air. Wesley was studying Katie with increasing unease. The details were too specific, too consistent for a random psychosis. Either she was an exceptionally skilled liar, or something genuinely terrible had happened to her and her friends in the woods surrounding the Crenshaw cabin. Brian tried to start the car Sunday morning, Katie said, but someone had cut the brake lines, slashed the tires. We were trapped. That night I heard Brian talking to someone outside the cabin. His voice got quieter and quieter, and then it just stopped. When I looked out the window, I saw this figure dragging something into the woods. Something that used to be Brian. "So how did you get away?" Ned asked, voicing the question they were all thinking while dreading the answer. "I didn't sleep. For 3 days, I didn't sleep. I knew he was out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. On Sunday night, I heard him trying to get in, testing windows, trying the door handle. So I went out the back while he was at the front, and I ran. I've been walking for days, staying on the road, hoping someone would come who could turn around before it was too late." Damon glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noting details that didn't quite add up. "Days? When did this happen?" "Last weekend, October 15th through the 18th. Wesley did the calculation automatically. "That was a week ago. You've been out here for a week?" Katie's face crumpled. And for the first time since she had entered their car, she looked genuinely lost rather than terrified. "Has it been that long?" "The days. They run together when you're not sleeping, when you're always listening for footsteps." The Honda crested another small hill, and ahead they could see a dirt road branching off to the right. According to Wesley's directions, this should be the turnoff to the Crenshaw cabin. Damon slowed the car, and as he did, Katie began to hyperventilate again. "Please," she gasped, the words coming in short bursts between desperate attempts to breathe. "Please don't turn down that road. If you take me back there, he'll kill us all. I know he will." Damon had reached the end of his patience. The weekend he had planned so carefully, the last perfect memory he had hoped to create with his friends before they scattered to their separate futures, was being destroyed by this woman's incomprehensible trauma. "Look," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I don't know what happened to you, and I'm sorry about your friends. But we drove 3 hours to get here, and we're not turning around because of some story about a boogeyman in the woods." Katie fumbled for the door handle with hands that shook so violently she could barely grasp it. "Then let me out here. I won't go back there. I can't." "Fine," Damon said, pulling over with the relieved finality of someone solving a problem. "This is probably for the best anyway." Wesley turned to face him, his medical ethics warring with his growing desire to be free of Katie's disturbing presence. "We can't just leave her here. Look at the state she's in." "She's not our responsibility," Damon replied, though something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as Wesley. "And frankly, I'm starting to wonder if her friends ever existed. Have you noticed she hasn't asked us to call the police? If 4 people really disappeared, wouldn't that be the first thing she'd want?" Katie had already climbed out of the car and was backing away from the Honda with the urgent desperation of someone fleeing a burning building. "The police don't come up here," she said, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "They know better. Everyone local knows better. It's only people from out of town, people who don't understand what lives in these woods." "Get some help," Iris called in through the open door, though her voice carried doubt rather than conviction. "There's a gas station about 10 miles back. They'll have a phone." Katie nodded, but she didn't move toward the road. Instead, she stood watching as Damon turned down the dirt path toward the Crenshaw cabin, her figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror until the trees swallowed her completely. The last they saw of her was the white of her Georgetown sweatshirt, bright against the dark forest, and her face, pale, desperate, and filled with the terrible knowledge of someone who had tried to save them and failed. "Well, that was seriously messed up," Ned said, once they were alone again, voicing what they were all thinking, but none had wanted to say in Katie's presence. "Mental illness is a hell of a thing," Damon observed, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Poor woman probably had some kind of psychotic break. Hopefully she finds her way to someone who can help her." Wesley wasn't convinced, and his medical training made him reluctant to dismiss Katie's symptoms as simple psychosis. "Did you see her injuries? Those scratches were real. Something happened to her." "Maybe she fell down a ravine," Iris suggested, though she was thinking about the specificity of Katie's story, the way trauma could create its own terrible logic. Maybe she got lost hiking, and her mind filled in the blanks with something more dramatic than the truth. They drove in relative silence down the winding dirt road, each lost in private thoughts about Katie Brennan and her disturbing story. The forest pressed close on both sides. Old-growth pines that blocked most of the afternoon sun and created a twilight atmosphere despite the early hour. The road was well-maintained but narrow, clearly designed for occasional use rather than regular traffic, and something about its isolation was beginning to make even Damon question the wisdom of their destination. After 20 minutes of careful navigation around potholes and fallen branches, they emerged into a small clearing where the Crenshaw cabin sat like something from a postcard. It was larger than they had expected, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney. Solar panels on the roof suggested modern conveniences, and a generator housing near the back promised reliable power even in storms. "Not exactly roughing it," Wesley observed as they climbed out of the Honda, though something in his voice suggested he would have preferred more primitive shelter, something that didn't speak of careful planning and regular maintenance. The afternoon air was crisp and clean, scented with pine needles and the faint smoke of distant fires. Somewhere nearby, a stream gurgled over rocks, and birds called to each other in the canopy overhead. It was peaceful in a way that should have made Katie's warning seem like the paranoid fantasies of a damaged mind, but instead the very perfection of the setting felt wrong, like a carefully constructed stage waiting for actors to arrive and begin a performance that none of them had volunteered to give. Damon retrieved the key from its hiding place under a decorative stone frog, exactly where Crenshaw had said it would be, and unlocked the front door. The interior was exactly what they had hoped for, rustic but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, leather furniture, and a kitchen well stocked with basic supplies. A staircase led to second-floor bedrooms, and large windows offered views of the surrounding forest. But as they explored the cabin, each of them noticed details that Katie's story had made ominous. The windows were all fitted with heavy-duty screens that could be locked from the inside. The doors were solid wood reinforced with metal plates, and in the kitchen, someone had installed a security system that monitored the perimeter of the cabin, a level of caution that seemed excessive for a simple weekend retreat. "This is perfect," Iris said, dropping her bag near the couch, though her voice carried a forced enthusiasm that suggested she was trying to convince herself. "We should write Crenshaw a thank you note." Ned was already setting up his portable stereo system, sorting through tapes to find the perfect soundtrack for their weekend retreat. But his movements were quick, nervous, and he kept glancing at the windows as though expecting to see something looking back at him. Wesley explored the kitchen, taking inventory of supplies and planning meals while trying to ignore the way the security monitors made him feel like they were already being watched. Damon stood at the large front window, looking out at the trees and thinking about Katie Brennan's story. He wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of someone whose mind had been broken by trauma or mental illness. But the security system, the reinforced doors, the careful way Crenshaw had chosen this particular location, it all suggested that someone had anticipated the need for protection against something more dangerous than bears or burglars. They spent the next several hours settling in, claiming bedrooms, and beginning the careful process of transformation from stressed students to carefree friends. By evening, Ned's music filled the cabin. Iris had started a fire in the stone fireplace. Wesley was preparing dinner, and Damon was mixing drinks with the generous hand of someone who had learned bartending from his father's private parties. But underneath their forced normalcy, each of them remained hyper-aware of their isolation, of the forest that pressed against the cabin's windows like something alive and patient. "To friendship," Damon proposed when they were all gathered around the fireplace with drinks and Wesley's surprisingly competent pasta. "To the last perfect weekend before the real world gets its claws in us." They drank. And for a moment, the warmth of alcohol and companionship made Katie Brennan seem like a distant memory, an unfortunate encounter with someone else's tragedy that had nothing to do with their own bright futures. But even as they laughed and talked and pretended everything was normal, each of them was thinking about locked screens and security systems, about the careful way locals avoided certain areas, about the possibility that they had driven 3 hours to place themselves exactly where someone wanted them to be. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Wesley asked, trying to maintain the pretense that this was still a normal weekend among friends. "Hiking? There are supposed to be some nice trails around here." "I brought my camera," Iris said. "I'd love to get some shots of the forest, maybe do a whole series on Southern Gothic landscapes." But as she spoke, she was thinking about Katie's description of Melissa's jacket hanging from a tree branch, torn and bloody. And wondering what other decorations might be waiting in the deep woods for photographers foolish enough to venture there alone. "Just don't wander off alone," Ned said, only half joking. "After that woman's story, I'm not taking any chances." "You don't actually believe her, do you?" Damon asked, though his question carried less conviction than it might have earlier in the day. "I mean, come on. A killer living in the woods who's been hunting people for decades? If that were true, don't you think someone would have done something about it?" Wesley considered this while studying the security monitors that showed empty forest in every direction. Maybe. Or maybe it's like she said. Maybe the locals know and just avoid certain areas. Maybe they've learned to coexist with something they can't control. "That's very romantic," Damon said. "But it's not how the world actually works. People don't just disappear without investigations, without media coverage, without someone asking questions." "People disappear all the time," Iris pointed out, thinking about the missing person reports that appeared in newspapers with decreasing frequency, about the way society had learned to accept certain losses as inevitable, especially people like us. College kids on weekend trips, young adults traveling alone. How many missing person cases do you think go unsolved every year? The conversation continued as the fire died down to embers and the wine took its effect. But underneath their intellectual discussion, Each of them was aware of the darkness beyond the windows, of the way the forest seemed to absorb sound and light, until the cabin felt like a tiny island of civilization, surrounded by something vast and hungry. Eventually, they began drifting toward their respective bedrooms, each claiming a space and beginning the intimate process of unpacking personal belongings in what they hoped would remain a temporary home. Damon had claimed the master bedroom on the first floor, a space with its own bathroom, and direct access to the back porch. Wesley and Ned took the two smaller bedrooms upstairs, while Iris chose the loft space above the living room. Drawn by its large windows and the way moonlight filtered through the trees. By midnight, the cabin was quiet except for the settling sounds of old wood and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Each of the four friends lay in their respective beds, processing the day's events and trying to convince themselves that tomorrow they would laugh about their paranoia. Only Iris remained awake, reading by flashlight and occasionally glancing out her windows at the dark forest beyond, where shadows moved in patterns that could have been wind or something else entirely. At some point in the early morning hours, she heard footsteps on the front porch. The sound was soft but deliberate, the measured pace of someone trying to move quietly while lacking the skill to be completely silent. Iris set down her book and listened, her heart rate increasing as the footsteps continued around the perimeter of the cabin. They paused at each window, and she imagined someone peering through the glass, studying the interior, cataloging the sleeping occupants and making notes for future reference. The footsteps stopped directly below her loft window. For several minutes there was only silence, but Iris could feel a presence outside. Patient, watchful, utterly still in the way that only predators could be still. She held her breath and fought the urge to look down, knowing instinctively that making herself visible would be a mistake she might not survive to regret. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps resumed their circuit around the cabin, then faded away into the forest. Iris gradually relaxed back into her sleeping bag, telling herself it was probably a raccoon or deer, some harmless forest creature investigating the human intrusion into its territory. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of gray-haired figures moving like shadows between the trees, patient as death and twice as certain. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of October sunshine that makes everything seem possible, and yesterday's fears seem foolish. The four friends gathered in the kitchen for coffee and Wesley's pancakes, and in the clean light of day, Iris's midnight fears seemed overwrought and silly. "Sleep well?" Damon asked. And she nodded, deciding not to mention the footsteps. After all, she couldn't be certain of what she had heard, and there was no point in spreading her anxiety to the others when they were all trying so hard to salvage their weekend. They spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin, following a well-marked trail that led to a small waterfall and swimming hole. The forest was beautiful in the autumn light, all gold and crimson leaves drifting down like confetti. Iris took photographs while Wesley collected interesting rocks and Ned identified bird calls. Damon seemed more relaxed than they had seen him in months, the perpetual tension of academic and social expectations finally loosening its grip. But it was Ned who first noticed they were being watched. "Don't look," he said quietly as they sat beside the waterfall eating sandwiches. "But there's someone in the trees across the stream, about 30 yards upstream behind that big pine." They continued their conversation about nothing in particular while subtly scanning the far bank. At first, none of them could see anything unusual. Then a slight movement caught Iris's eye, and she glimpsed a tall, thin figure standing motionless in deep shadow. The distance and tree cover made details impossible, but the figure's stillness had an unnatural quality, like a predator that had learned to become part of the landscape while studying its prey. Should we say something? Wesley murmured, his medical training urging him toward direct communication, even as his instincts screamed warnings. Try to talk to him? Absolutely not, Damon said immediately, though his voice carried the tight control of someone fighting panic. Let's just pack up and head back to the cabin. They gathered their things with studied casualness, maintaining the pretense of normal conversation, while hyper-aware of the watching presence across the water. As they walked back down the trail, Iris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, though she never saw or heard anything to confirm her suspicion. It was more primitive than that. The ancestral knowledge that something was tracking them through the forest, noting their movements and habits, learning everything it needed to know about their weaknesses and fears. Back at the cabin, they spent the afternoon playing cards and reading, but the easy camaraderie of the morning had been replaced by a subtle tension that no amount of forced conversation could dispel. Each of them found reasons to check the windows periodically, and when Damon suggested grilling steaks on the back porch for dinner, Wesley quickly volunteered to help, unwilling to let his friend venture outside alone. "We're being ridiculous," Damon said as they stood at the grill, both of them constantly scanning the tree line while trying to appear casual. It was probably just a hiker. Probably, Wesley agreed, but he stayed close to the cabin's back door, and he was grateful when the steaks finished cooking and they could retreat inside. Because there had been something wrong about the figure by the waterfall, not just its stillness, but the sense that it belonged in the forest in a way that normal humans didn't, as though it had adapted to life there through methods that civilized people prefer not to contemplate. Evening fell earlier than expected, the forest canopy creating premature twilight that made the cabin's interior feel like a sanctuary under siege. They ate by candlelight, partly for ambiance and partly because the darkness beyond the window seemed less threatening when they couldn't see into it clearly. But even with the curtains drawn and the doors locked, each of them remained aware of their vulnerability. 4 soft, civilized people surrounded by something vast and patient and utterly without mercy. "I keep thinking about that woman," Iris said as they finished dinner, voicing what they were all thinking but none had wanted to say. Katie. Oh, what if she was telling the truth? "About what?" Damon asked, though his voice carried less skepticism than it might have yesterday. "About some mythical forest dweller who's been killing people for decades without anyone noticing." "Not mythical," Wesley said quietly, thinking about the security system. The reinforced doors, the careful way locals had learned to avoid certain areas. Real, just careful. Smart enough to choose victims who won't be missed immediately, isolated enough to avoid discovery, patient enough to wait for the right opportunities. Ned had grown increasingly agitated as the conversation continued, his street-honed instincts screaming that they were in immediate danger. "So what are you saying? That we're in danger? That we should leave?" "I'm not saying anything," Wesley replied, though his hand moved unconsciously toward the kitchen knife he had placed within his reach. "I'm just thinking about possibilities." "The possibility," Damon said with forced humor, "is that we're 4 intelligent people scaring ourselves with ghost stories. Tomorrow morning we'll drive back to Austin, and this will all seem silly in retrospect." But even as he spoke, he was thinking about the figure by the waterfall, about Katie Brennan's desperate warnings, about the way the forest seemed to press against the cabin's windows like something alive and hungry. He was beginning to understand that intelligence could be a liability when confronted with something that operated outside the boundaries of civilized understanding. That all their education and privilege meant nothing to something that had learned to hunt humans with the patience of stone and the precision of clockwork. They tried to maintain normal evening activities, card games, conversation, music. But everyone was hyper-aware of sounds from outside. When a branch scraped against the roof, they all froze until the sound passed. When something rattled the back door handle, Wesley grabbed the kitchen knife before determining it was probably just wind. But probably wasn't certainty, and certainty was what they needed in a place where the normal rules of civilization seemed to have been suspended. By 10 o'clock, the pretense of normalcy had become exhausting. They extinguished the candles and prepared for bed, each retreating to their private spaces, but none really expecting sleep. Damon checked all the door locks twice. Wesley positioned a chair against his bedroom door, and Iris moved her sleeping bag away from the loft windows. Ned simply sat on his bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to decide whether immediate flight might be their only chance of survival. It was Ned who first heard the woman calling for help. No, her voice carried through the forest with the desperate quality of someone in genuine distress, rising and falling with sobs that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was Katie Brennan's voice, though somehow different, as though she were calling to them from a great distance or through some medium that distorted sound and meaning. "Help me," the voice pleaded, circling the cabin like a living thing. "Please, someone help me. He's coming. He's right behind me." Wesley appeared in the hallway outside Ned's room, knife still in hand and his face pale with the realization that their worst fears were being confirmed. "Did you hear that?" The others gathered at the top of the stairs, all four of them straining to locate the source of Katie's cries. She seemed to be circling the cabin, her voice growing closer and then fading, as though she were running through the trees while calling for assistance. But there was something wrong with the acoustics, something that made her voice seem to come from above them as much as around them, as though the forest itself had learned to speak with her voice. "We have to help her," Iris said, already moving toward the stairs, her literary mind recognizing the archetypal quality of the scene while her human heart responded to the genuine terror in Katie's voice. "No." Damon caught her arm with surprising force. "Absolutely not. This is exactly what she was talking about. Someone using her voice, trying to draw us out." "That's impossible," Wesley said, though his voice carried doubt as thick as fog. How could someone replicate her voice so perfectly? The calling continued for another 10 minutes, sometimes seeming to come from directly outside the cabin's front door, other times echoing from deep in the forest. Katie's voice grew increasingly desperate, increasingly specific. "Damon? Wesley? Please, I can see your lights. He's got a knife. He's cutting." The voice broke off in a scream that made all four of them flinch, then resumed at a different location entirely. "Iris. Ned. Don't let him do to you what he did to us." They huddled together in the living room, reluctant to return to separate bedrooms where they would be vulnerable and alone. The fire had died down to glowing coals, casting shifting shadows on the walls and making every corner seem potentially threatening. Outside, Katie's voice continued its impossible circuit of the cabin, now pleading, now screaming, now dropping to whispers that somehow carried farther than her shouts. "In the morning," Damon said, his voice tight with the kind of control that comes from acknowledging genuine terror while refusing to surrender to it. "First light, we pack up and leave. This whole weekend was a mistake." None of them argued. Whatever was happening in these woods, whether it was Katie Brennan's delusional episode made manifest or something more genuinely dangerous, they no longer wanted to be part of it. They would return to their normal lives, their academic concerns, their predictable futures. This weekend would become a story they told carefully, editing out the parts that made them question their understanding of how the world actually worked. They took turns keeping watch through the remaining hours of darkness, two sleeping while two remained alert by the dying fire. Nothing else disturbed the night directly, but each of them noticed sounds that didn't quite fit. Footsteps that stopped when they tried to listen for them. Whispers that might have been wind. The occasional scrape of something against the cabin's exterior walls. When dawn finally arrived, pale and cold through the cabin's windows, they were already packing their belongings with the efficient desperation of people fleeing a natural disaster. "Leave everything," Damon said as Wesley tried to wash their breakfast dishes, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision that would not be questioned. "Crenshaw can deal with it later, or not. I just want to get out of here." They loaded the Honda with minimal conversation, each lost in private relief at the prospect of escape. The forest that had seemed beautiful yesterday now felt oppressive and watchful, full of shadows that could conceal anything. Even the morning bird song sounded wrong, as though the normal rhythms of nature had been somehow corrupted by the presence of something that didn't belong there. Damon started the engine, and they pulled away from the cabin without looking back. The dirt road that had seemed rustic and charming now felt like a trap, winding endlessly through trees that pressed close on both sides. Every turn could conceal an obstacle. Every straight stretch could hide someone waiting in the road ahead, with patience learned from decades of practice. But they reached the highway without incident, and as the Honda accelerated toward Austin, the nightmare of the past 2 days began to fade into something that could be rationalized, explained away, forgotten. They were young and intelligent, and had their whole lives ahead of them. There was no room in those lives for the kind of primitive terror they had experienced in the deep woods of East Texas. No space for the possibility that some dangers were too old and patient to be defeated by civilization's tools. They drove in silence for the first hour, each processing the weekend in their own way. Damon focused on the familiar rhythm of highway driving, letting the miles wash away his fear and restore his confidence in the rational world of cause and effect. Wesley mentally cataloged the rational explanations for everything they had experienced, building a framework of logic that could contain their terror within acceptable boundaries. Iris composed the story she would never write, the one that captured the feeling of being hunted by something that understood the human heart better than humans understood themselves. Ned selected music for the drive home, choosing familiar songs that would restore the normal soundtrack of their lives and drown out the memory of Katie's voice calling from the forest. None of them noticed the smell until they were almost back to Austin. It started subtly. Just a faint chemical odor that could have been explained by industrial activity or agricultural processing along the route. But as they drew closer to the city, the smell grew stronger and more specific. It was the distinctive smell of natural gas, the mercaptan odorant added to make leaks detectable before they became fatal, and it seemed to be coming from inside the Honda itself. "Do you smell that?" Wesley asked, just as Damon began pulling over to the shoulder with the quick reflexes of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by 2 days of constant vigilance. They climbed out of the car with the urgent efficiency of people who had learned not to ignore warning signs, no matter how subtle. The search for the source of the odor was methodical, but desperate. They had escaped the forest. They were almost home, and the idea that danger had followed them into the civilized world was almost too horrible to contemplate. It was Iris who found the first sign of sabotage, a small puncture in the Honda's gas tank, a neat hole that had been drilled with surgical precision and plugged with a rubber stopper designed to dissolve gradually in gasoline. The stopper had finally dissolved completely, allowing gas to drip onto the hot exhaust system in exactly the way someone had calculated it would. But the punctured tank was only the beginning. Ned's exploration of the car's undercarriage revealed something that transformed their fear into something approaching absolute panic. Wired to the Honda's chassis, directly above the dripping gasoline, was a simple timing device connected to a spark-generating mechanism. It was crude but effective, and the kind of device that could be assembled from hardware store components by someone with basic knowledge of electronics and unlimited patience. According to the timer's display, they had approximately 4 minutes before detonation. They ran from the Honda as though it were already burning, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the weapon their car had become. Behind them, traffic continued normally on the highway, commuters and travelers unaware that death had been traveling among them in the form of 4 college students and their mobile bomb, counting down the seconds until their escape became their execution. The Honda exploded with surprising force, sending a column of black smoke into the clear October sky and scattering debris across 3 lanes of highway. The sound was enormous, final, the kind of violence that makes headlines and leaves investigators searching for explanations that never quite capture the full scope of what actually happened. Emergency vehicles arrived within minutes, but by then there was nothing left to save except the 4 young lives that had escaped by pure chance, not through any wisdom or preparation on their part, but because their pursuer had made one small error in his calculations. As they gave their statements to police and fire investigators, the 4 friends began to understand the true horror of their situation. The timer had been set before they even reached the cabin on Friday afternoon. Someone had sabotaged their car while they slept, calculating exactly how long the return journey would take and ensuring the explosion would occur at highway speed when escape would be impossible and survival unlikely. The saboteur had planned their deaths with the precision of someone who understood both human psychology and automotive engineering. He had counted on their predictable behavior, their desire to leave early, their tendency to drive straight home without stops or delays. He had turned their own escape into the mechanism of their destruction, making their relief at leaving Forest into the very thing that would kill them. But he had made one small error. He had calculated, based on the assumption that Damon would drive directly back to Austin without stopping, that fear would make them reckless rather than cautious. He hadn't accounted for a gas station break, a traffic delay, or the simple human tendency to drive more carefully when carrying something precious. Like 4 young lives that still had futures to fulfill. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing patterns stretching back more than a decade. Missing persons reports filed by out-of-town visitors to East Texas, all of whom had planned weekend trips to remote cabins. Abandoned cars discovered months later in ravines and forests, their occupants never found. Local residents who spoke carefully about certain areas where hunting was discouraged and hiking was avoided. But no arrests were ever made, and no concrete evidence was ever recovered. The 4 friends graduated from college that spring and scattered across the country to pursue their separate destinies. They maintained contact for a few years, but gradually the bonds formed and shared terror loosened, and they became names in Christmas cards, faces in wedding photographs, voices in increasingly rare phone calls. None of them ever returned to East Texas. 15 years later, Damon Reese was driving home from a medical conference in Dallas when he saw the woman on the side of Interstate 20. She stood beside a disabled sedan, hood up, cell phone pressed to her ear with the frustrated gestures of someone receiving no signal. Damon slowed his BMW and pulled onto the shoulder, muscle memory and medical training overriding 15 years of careful avoidance. Through his windshield, he could see that she was young, probably a college student, wearing a University of Texas sweatshirt and looking genuinely distressed. He sat with his engine running, watching her in his mirrors, his hand frozen on the door handle. The October evening light was fading, and traffic was sparse on this stretch of highway. She was alone and vulnerable. Exactly the kind of person he would have helped without hesitation before that weekend in the piney woods. The woman noticed his BMW and began walking toward him, relief evident in her expression. She was saying something, probably thanking him for stopping, probably explaining her situation in the way that stranded motorists do when rescue appears. Damon's hand tightened on the door handle. Then very slowly he shifted into drive and pulled back onto the highway, leaving the woman standing alone in his rearview mirror, her mouth open in surprise and dawning desperation. He drove home to his wife and children with his hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing he had probably left an innocent person in genuine need of help, knowing also that he would rather live with that guilt and risk discovering he had been wrong about her innocence. In his mirror, the woman grew smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely, swallowed by the gathering Texas darkness. Story 2. The first time Leo Kessler heard the voice, he was mixing the death scene for a thriller called Night Harbor. 3 in the morning in his Scottsdale studio, the desert silence pressed against the soundproofed walls like a living thing. He had been layering ambient tracks. Wind through broken glass, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, the wet sound of breathing growing shallow. When something else emerged from the speakers, a whisper, so faint it might have been the ghost of a sigh. "Can't breathe." Leo's fingers froze over the mixing board. He rewound the track and played it again. Nothing. The ambient sounds rolled forward in their carefully orchestrated decay, but the whisper had vanished like smoke. But as he reached for the fader to adjust the actress's dying breath, the voice came again. And this time it spoke in her exact vocal tone, mimicking the tremulous quality of her performance with unnerving precision. "You left me, Leo." The words cut through the mix like a blade. Leo's hand slammed down on the stop button so hard the entire console shuddered. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the frozen timeline. The actress in the film was named Monica Reeves. She played a drowning victim, and somehow, impossibly, her voice had just spoken his name with an intimacy that made his skin crawl. He rubbed his eyes and reached for his coffee. The cup was empty, though he couldn't remember finishing it. Outside, a coyote called across the Sonoran landscape, its voice threading through the gaps in his concentration. Leo had been working 16-hour days for the past month, chasing a deadline that seemed to recede with each passing hour. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon among sound engineers who pushed themselves too hard. The brain, starved of rest, began manufacturing its own input. But as he reached for the fader, the whisper came again, so cold. This time he was ready. His hand slammed down on the pause button, freezing the timeline at exactly 2 hours, 47 minutes, and 33 seconds. He isolated each track, listening through headphones that cost more than most people's cars. The wind track was clean. The fluorescent hum contained only the 60-cycle buzz he'd captured at an abandoned office building in Tempe. The breathing was his own, recorded during a particularly intense session last winter. Nothing that shouldn't be there. Yet when he played all 3 tracks together, the whisper emerged like a photograph developing in chemical baths, suddenly present, undeniably real. Leo had been designing sound for films for nearly 2 decades. He understood the physics of audio, the way frequencies could mask and unmask each other, how the human brain processed complex waveforms. He knew about pareidolia, the tendency to hear voices in static, messages in random noise. But this wasn't random. The whisper was consistent. appearing in the exact same place each time he played the sequence. He spent the next 4 hours dissecting the audio, running it through spectrum analyzers, looking for artifacts in the digital file. He found nothing that could account for the voice. The whisper existed in some liminal space between the tracks, emerging only when they combined, like a chemical reaction that produced something entirely new. By 7 in the morning, Leo's eyes burned and his hands shook with caffeine and exhaustion. The whisper had grown stronger, more distinct. Now he could make out fragments of words, syllables that seemed to claw their way up from some buried frequency range. "Leo, can't help me." He tore off his headphones and stumbled backward from the mixing board. His reflection stared back from the control room glass. Hollow-eyed, stubbled, wearing the same black flag t-shirt he'd put on yesterday morning. Behind him, the studio stretched away in careful shadows, filled with the tools of his trade. Microphones like mechanical flowers, acoustic panels that turned sound into silence, speakers that could reproduce every frequency the human ear could perceive. And somewhere in that forest of equipment, a voice was calling his name. The client meeting should have been routine. Leo had worked with Meridian Pictures before, crafting soundscapes for their mid-budget thrillers and horror films. They paid well and gave him creative freedom, understanding that his reputation for creating deeply unsettling audio environments was worth the premium they paid for his services. But as he sat in the glass-walled conference room overlooking the sprawl of Phoenix, Leo found himself unable to concentrate on the director's notes about the submarine thriller they wanted him to score. The woman across from him, Janet something, he hadn't caught her last name, was explaining the emotional beats they needed to hit in the drowning sequence, but her words kept dissolving into white noise. Because the whisper was there. Even in the sterile corporate environment, with its recirculated air and the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 10, he could hear it threading through the ambient sound like a parasite. Not through the speakers this time. There were no speakers, just Janet's voice and the rustle of papers and the almost inaudible whir of the building's HVAC system. Can't breathe? So cold. Leo. He tried to focus, gripping his pen and pretending to take notes. But as they talked, the whisper continued its steady infiltration of his consciousness, and something else began to intrude. A bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from inside his own body. The conference room's aggressive air conditioning couldn't account for the way his breath started to mist slightly, or the way goosebumps rose along his arms despite the stifling heat outside. And underneath the recycled air and industrial carpet smell, Leo caught something else, the faint but unmistakable scent of muddy river water. "Don't leave me. Please. Leo. Are you feeling all right?" Janet had stopped talking and was looking at him with concern. "You look pale." Leo realized he was gripping the edge of the conference table hard enough to whiten his knuckles, and his teeth had begun to chatter slightly. The cold was so intense it felt like drowning in ice water, but when he looked around the room, everyone else appeared comfortable. "Just tired," he managed through lips that felt numb. "Long night in the studio." "Maybe we should reschedule," suggested the director, a nervous man named Patterson, who kept adjusting his glasses. "This project's important to us. We want you at your best." "No, I'm fine." "Really?" Leo pulled out his notebook and pen, props to maintain the illusion of normalcy. "Tell me about this submarine sequence again." He sat in his car for 20 minutes, engine running, trying to convince himself that stress and sleep deprivation were playing tricks on his mind. Sound engineers were susceptible to a variety of auditory disorders. Tinnitus from exposure to loud sounds, hyperacusis that made normal volumes unbearable, even musical hallucinations, where the brain generated phantom melodies. What he was experiencing had to be a variation on that theme. His subconscious was synthesizing a voice from the random noise of everyday life, the way some people saw faces in clouds or heard voices in static. The solution was simple: rest, medication if necessary, maybe a brief vacation to let his neural pathways reset themselves. But even as he formulated this rational explanation, Leo knew it was inadequate. The whisper wasn't random, it was too consistent, too purposeful, and it knew his name. The email from Meridian Pictures arrived on a Thursday morning, and Leo read it 3 times before the words sank in. The mix for Night Harbor had been rejected. Again. "We're hearing an unpleasant frequency artifact around the 247 mark," the message read. "It's creating a resonance that's quite distracting during the death scene. Can you clean this up and resubmit?" Leo stared at his computer screen, his coffee growing cold in his hands. This was the 4th revision request for the same sequence, and each time the feedback was the same: an unwanted sound that interfered with the emotional impact of the scene. But every time Leo examined the audio, he found nothing wrong with the technical mix. The levels were perfect, the frequency response clean, no artifacts or digital noise that could account for the complaint. What they were hearing, he was beginning to suspect, was the whisper. Somehow it was bleeding through into the final mix in ways that his equipment couldn't detect, but human ears could perceive as wrong, even if they couldn't identify what they were hearing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The voice wasn't just destroying his sanity, it was destroying his career. Dr. Amanda Soto specialized in auditory processing disorders at the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. Leo had found her through an online search, drawn by her credentials and her research into phantom sounds and auditory hallucinations. Her office was determinedly cheerful, with abstract paintings in primary colors and a view of the hospital's healing garden. "How long have you been experiencing these auditory intrusions?" she asked, making notes on a tablet. She was younger than Leo had expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. 3 weeks now, Leo said. He had debated whether to tell her the full truth and had decided on a modified version. "It started while I was working on a film score. At first I thought it was bleed-through from another track, but the voice appears even when I'm not in the studio." "Can you describe the voice?" "Female. Young, I think. She sounds distressed." Leo paused, choosing his words carefully. The audio quality is strained, like she's speaking from underwater or through some kind of barrier. Dr. Soto nodded, making more notes. "Any identifiable words?" "She says my name sometimes, and phrases like, 'can't breathe' or 'so cold.' It's not always clear." "Do you recognize the voice?" The question hit Leo like a physical blow. He had been avoiding that particular inquiry, even in his own thoughts, but the doctor's direct approach forced him to confront it. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "Sometimes I think I do, but it might just be my imagination filling in details." Dr. Soto set down her tablet and leaned forward. "Leo, I want to be clear about something. Auditory hallucinations are more common than most people realize, especially among individuals in high-stress professions that involve intensive listening. There's no shame in what you're experiencing, and there are effective treatments." "So you think that's what this is? Hallucinations?" "I think it's likely, given your profession and the stress indicators you've described. But I'd like to run some tests to rule out any underlying neurological issues." The tests took most of the afternoon. Leo submitted to hearing exams, neurological assessments, and a battery of psychological evaluations that probed his mental state with uncomfortable precision. Through it all, the whisper continued its steady presence, sometimes fading to near inaudibility, sometimes swelling until it threatened to drown out the doctor's questions. "Don't forget me. Please don't forget." The results, when they came back 2 days later, were frustratingly inconclusive. Leo's hearing was excellent, his neurological responses normal. The psychological evaluation suggested elevated stress levels and possible symptoms of depression, but nothing that would explain the persistent auditory experiences. "I want to try you on a low dose of antipsychotic medication," Dr. Soto explained during their follow-up appointment. "Sometimes these phantom sounds respond well to drugs that affect dopamine levels in the brain." Leo accepted the prescription with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The medication came with a list of side effects that read like the ingredients for a nightmare: weight gain, sexual dysfunction, increased risk of diabetes, and something called tardive dyskinesia that could cause permanent involuntary movements. But if it stopped the whisper, he would gladly accept any cost. The pills didn't work. If anything, the voice became clearer over the following weeks, more insistent. Leo found himself unable to work, unable to sleep without the accompaniment of that desperate, watery plea. He started drinking to quiet his mind, then drinking more when the alcohol proved inadequate against the relentless intrusion. "Help me. I'm so scared. Leo, please." The voice was calling to him now, and not just speaking, but pleading, and the sound of it was breaking something fundamental inside his chest. Gabriel Ortega arrived at Leo's studio on a Tuesday morning in October, when the desert air finally carried the first hint of coolness after the brutal summer. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes and careful hands, carrying a case full of equipment that looked more like scientific instruments than the crystals and sage bundles Leo had expected. "You said on the phone that you're being haunted by a voice," Gabriel said, setting up what appeared to be a digital recording device near Leo's mixing board. "Can you be more specific?" Leo had found Gabriel through a referral from a friend in Los Angeles who worked in film and claimed to have had his house cleansed of malevolent spirits after a poltergeist started interfering with his editing equipment. Gabriel's website described him as a paranormal researcher and spiritual counselor with testimonials from clients who credited him with resolving everything from demonic infestations to residual hauntings. "It's a woman's voice," Leo explained, feeling ridiculous even as he said it. "She whispers through my recordings, but I can hear her other places too now. In restaurants, walking down the street, even here when I'm not recording anything." Gabriel nodded as if this were perfectly normal. He was dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking more like an accountant than Leo's preconceptions of a ghost hunter. "How long since it started?" "About 2 months." "Any traumatic events in your life recently? Deaths in the family, relationship breakups, major life changes?" "Nothing like that," Leo said, though something cold moved in his stomach as he spoke. "My life's been pretty stable." Gabriel continued setting up his equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared thermometers, devices Leo didn't recognize. "I want to record the environment while you work. Sometimes spiritual entities manifest more strongly when the subject is engaged in the activity that first attracted them." Leo powered up his mixing board and loaded the problematic sequence from Night Harbor, the one he'd been unable to get approved. As the familiar interface came to life, Gabriel's equipment began registering subtle changes: temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, variations in air pressure that his instruments translated into graphs and numbers. "Play something," Gabriel said, adjusting the sensitivity on a device that looked like a radio crossed with a metal detector. Leo started the death scene, layers of sound building toward the climax. Wind through broken glass, the hum of lights, the actress's shallow breathing. As the audio reached its peak intensity, the whisper emerged right on cue. "Leo, don't leave me. Please don't leave me here." Gabriel's equipment registered nothing unusual. No temperature change, no electromagnetic spike, no indication that anything supernatural was occurring in the studio. He listened through Leo's headphones, frowning with concentration. But when Leo paused the playback and asked what he'd heard, Gabriel shook his head. "Just the ambient sounds," he said. "Are you hearing something else?" The realization hit Leo like a physical blow. Gabriel couldn't hear the voice, even through Leo's own equipment, using headphones that reproduced every subtle frequency. The paranormal investigator heard nothing but the sounds Leo had intentionally placed in the mix. They spent 4 hours together, Gabriel methodically documenting the studio's environment, while Leo played various projects. Each time, the whisper was present and clear, sometimes nearly overwhelming in its intensity. And each time, Gabriel's instruments registered nothing unusual, until Leo played the Night Harbor drowning sequence again. As the audio reached its climax and the whisper swelled to nearly unbearable levels. "Leo, don't leave me. Please don't leave me here." One of the Gabriel's EMF detectors suddenly spiked into the red zone, its needle jumping so violently that both men noticed it. "Interesting," Gabriel murmured, tapping the device. "Probably just interference from your equipment. Cell tower signal, maybe, or a microwave oven in another unit." But Leo had seen the spike occur at the exact moment the voice was strongest, and the timing was too precise to be coincidental. The detector had registered something, even if Gabriel chose to dismiss it as electronic noise. "Did you hear anything during that sequence?" Leo asked, his voice carefully neutral. Gabriel frowned, adjusting his headphones. "Just the drowning sounds. Very realistic work, by the way. The way you layered the pressure effects really sells the claustrophobic feeling." Leo wanted to argue, to insist that the voice was objectively real, but Gabriel's equipment was more sensitive than anything in his studio. If there were a supernatural presence generating audible sound waves, those instruments would have detected it. "I'm not saying your experience isn't real," Gabriel explained as he packed his equipment. "But I'm not finding evidence of spiritual activity. Sometimes what we perceive as hauntings are actually manifestations of psychological trauma. The mind can create remarkably convincing sensory experiences when it's trying to process unresolved grief or guilt." "Have you considered talking to a therapist?" Gabriel asked gently. "Someone who specializes in trauma counseling?" After Gabriel left, Leo sat alone in his studio, staring at the mixing board that had become both his livelihood and his torment. The whisper was there, faint but persistent, weaving through the ambient sound of the room's ventilation system. "I'm still here, still waiting. Why won't you help me?" He was losing his mind. That was the only explanation that made sense now. The stress of his profession, combined with some undiagnosed neurological condition, was causing him to hear voices that existed nowhere but in his own deteriorating brain. But even as he accepted this rational explanation, Leo knew it wasn't the complete truth, because deep in some carefully buried part of his consciousness, he recognized the voice, had recognized it from the very first whisper, though he'd been fighting that recognition for months now. The voice belonged to Celia, his sister Celia, who had been dead for 15 years. The memory came back in fragments, the way traumatic experiences often do, not as a coherent narrative, but as a series of sensory impressions that his mind had spent a decade and a half learning to suppress. The curve on Highway 87, where the guardrail ended and the embankment dropped away toward Salt River. The rain that had been falling for 3 days, unusual for Arizona in September, turning the normally dry wash into a torrent of muddy water. Celia singing along to something on the radio, her voice clear and strong. The voice that had earned her a scholarship to study music at ASU. They had been driving back from their parents' house in Payson after their father's birthday party. Leo was behind the wheel of his Honda Civic, Celia in the passenger seat. Both of them tired and ready to get back to Phoenix. She had been talking about her audition for the university choir, nervous and excited, practicing scales under her breath. The deer had come out of nowhere, leaping across the highway in a fluid arc that seemed almost choreographed. Leo swerved instinctively, felt the car's rear wheels lose traction on the wet asphalt, and then they were spinning, the world rotating around them like a carnival ride gone wrong. The car hit the embankment sideways and rolled twice before coming to rest upside down in the rushing water. Leo's seatbelt had held, but the impact had left him dazed, blood running down his face from a gash on his scalp. The car was filling with river water, cold and muddy and moving with terrifying speed. This was the part of the memory that his mind had worked hardest to bury. The sequence of events that transformed an accident into something unforgivable. Leo's door was jammed, but his window had shattered during the roll. He could see moonlight above the surface of the water, maybe 6 feet away. His seatbelt release worked, and suddenly he was free, able to move in the cramped space of the inverted car. Celia was unconscious, blood on her forehead, her seatbelt holding her suspended above the rising water. Leo tried to wake her, shaking her shoulder, calling her name, but the water was rising fast, already up to the level of the seats, and the current was pushing the car downstream toward a concrete culvert that would crush anything in its path. He could have freed her. The seatbelt mechanism was damaged but not broken. With time and effort, he could have gotten her out. But the car was moving, grinding against rocks on the bottom of the wash, and Leo could feel the current grabbing at his legs. In perhaps 30 seconds, they would reach the culvert and both of them would die. So he made the choice that had been eating at him ever since. He took a breath and swam up through the broken window, leaving Celia behind. The water was shockingly cold, the current stronger than he had expected. It carried him downstream and slammed him against the concrete abutment of a bridge, breaking 2 ribs and dislocating his shoulder. But he was alive, gasping and retching on a muddy bank, while the river continued its rampage through the desert. The rescue workers found Celia's body 3 days later, pinned in the wreckage of the Honda 2 miles downstream from where the car had entered the water. The official cause of death was drowning, though the coroner noted evidence of head trauma that might have rendered her unconscious before the car filled with water. Leo told the investigators that both of them had been knocked unconscious in the crash. He said he woke up outside the car, unsure how he had escaped, and assumed Celia had been thrown clear as well. By the time he realized she was still trapped, the current had carried the vehicle too far away for him to reach it. Everyone believed his story. Why wouldn't they? It was a tragic accident, the kind of random catastrophe that could destroy any family. The insurance company paid out without question. His parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, never suspected that their son might be responsible for her death. But Leo knew the truth. In that crucial moment when everything depended on his choice, he had chosen his own survival over his sister's life. And Celia, talented, beautiful Celia with her scholarship and her music and her dreams, had drowned alone in the darkness, calling his name. Leo, can't breathe. Help me. Please don't leave me here. Now, sitting in his studio with the weight of memory crushing down on him like deep water, Leo understood what was happening to him. The whisper wasn't a supernatural visitation or a symptom of mental illness. It was the sound of his own guilt given voice, his unconscious mind's attempt to process a trauma he had spent 15 years refusing to acknowledge. His sister was calling to him across the years, and this time he was going to answer. The Orfield Laboratories anechoic chamber in Minneapolis was the quietest place on Earth, a room so silent that visitors could hear their own blood circulating, their hearts beating, their nervous systems firing. Leo had flown there on a Tuesday in November, carrying only a single ultra-sensitive microphone, and the desperate hope that perfect silence might finally reveal the source of the voice that was destroying his life. Dr. Stephen Orfield, the facility's founder, had been intrigued by Leo's request. Most people wanted to experience the chamber's profound quiet as a meditative exercise or to test their tolerance for sensory deprivation. Leo wanted to record whatever he might hear in the absence of all external sound. The current record for time spent in the chamber is 45 minutes, Dr. Orfield explained, as he led Leo through a series of sound locks toward the chamber's entrance. Most people can't handle more than 30 minutes. The brain isn't designed for complete silence. It starts manufacturing its own input. The chamber itself was smaller than Leo had expected, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with walls covered in sound-absorbing wedges that looked like geometric stalactites. The floor was a suspended metal mesh that prevented footsteps from resonating through the building's structure. When Dr. Orfield closed the door behind him, Leo experienced silence unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was not merely quiet. It was the absence of sound made manifest, a presence in itself that seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water. Within seconds, Leo could hear his pulse, his breathing, the subtle sounds of his clothing rustling as he moved. But underneath those biological noises threading through the perfect acoustical void, he could hear the whisper. Leo, I'm so cold. Why did you leave me? In the chamber's perfect isolation, Celia's voice was deafening, not coming through the microphone, not emerging from any external source, but rising from somewhere deep inside his own auditory system, like water bubbling up from an underground spring. Leo set up his equipment with shaking hands, knowing now that no recording would capture what he was hearing, but needing to complete the experiment anyway. The microphone registered nothing but the ambient sound of his own presence in the room. But the whisper continued, growing stronger with each passing minute. I tried to call for help. The water was so cold, I couldn't breathe. Celia, Leo whispered, into the perfect darkness. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You left me to die. You saved yourself and let me drown. Why couldn't you help me? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Leo fell to his knees on the metal mesh floor, tears streaming down his face. 15 years of suppressed guilt finally breaking free. I was scared, he said aloud, his voice strange and hollow in the acoustic void. The car was moving so fast, and I thought we were both going to die. I thought if I could get help. You thought of yourself. Only yourself. And I died, alone in the dark. I know, Leo sobbed. I know what I did. I've been hearing you every day since then, even when I thought I'd forgotten. Every sound I've ever recorded, every piece of audio I've ever mixed, you've been there underneath it all. The whisper changed then, becoming softer, less accusatory. I was so afraid. The water kept rising. I called your name, but you were already gone. Forgive me, Leo pleaded. Please, Celia, I know I don't deserve it, but please forgive me. For a long moment, there was only the profound silence of the chamber and the sound of Leo's ragged breathing. Then, so faintly he might have imagined it, came his sister's voice one final time. I forgive you, but you have to forgive yourself. You have to let me go. Leo stayed in the chamber for 2 hours, longer than anyone had managed before. When Dr. Orfield finally opened the door to check on him, he found Leo sitting peacefully on the floor, no longer crying, his recording equipment packed away. Did you find what you were looking for? Dr. Orfield asked. Yes, Leo said. I think I did. The drive back to Arizona took Leo 3 days. He could have flown, but he needed the time to process what had happened in the chamber, to understand the fundamental shift that had occurred in his relationship with both his guilt and his sister's memory. The whisper was gone, not diminished or transformed, but truly absent for the first time in months. The ambient sounds of the highway, wind noise, engine vibration, the hum of his tires on asphalt, were just that. Mechanical sounds without any underlying presence or hidden message. Leo stopped in small towns along the way, sitting in diners and coffee shops, listening to the ordinary conversations of strangers without hearing Celia's voice threaded through their words. The relief was almost overwhelming, like breathing freely after months of suffocation. But with the relief came something else, a deeper understanding of what he had lost 15 years ago and what he had been trying to recover ever since. Dr. Evelyn Reed had an office in Old Town Scottsdale, in a converted adobe house surrounded by Palo Verde trees. Leo had found her through a referral from Dr. Soto, who had been intrigued by his account of the anechoic chamber experience. Dr. Reed specialized in trauma therapy, particularly cases involving survivors' guilt and delayed processing of catastrophic events. What you experienced is called a psychosomatic auditory phenomenon, she explained during their first session. It's rare but not unknown. Essentially, your brain was generating the sound of your sister's voice as a way of keeping her presence alive while simultaneously punishing you for your survival. But why now, Leo asked. Why did it start 2 months ago after all these years? Trauma doesn't follow a predictable timeline, Dr. Reed said. Sometimes the mind can suppress difficult memories for decades. But eventually, the psychological pressure builds to a point where the defenses break down. Usually there's a trigger stress, a significant life event, sometimes just reaching a particular age. Leo thought about the past year, the increasing pressure of his work schedule, the subtle but persistent feeling that his career success was somehow built on a foundation of lies. He had been pushing himself harder and harder, as if professional achievement could somehow balance the scales of his guilt. The voice you were hearing wasn't really your sister, Dr. Reed continued. It was your own unconscious mind trying to process the trauma of that night. The reason it disappeared in the chamber is that you finally allowed yourself to confront the truth of what happened. Oh, so I'm not going crazy? You're not going crazy, she assured him. But you are carrying a tremendous burden of unprocessed grief and guilt. The goal now is to help you understand that surviving doesn't make you responsible for your sister's death. The therapy sessions were difficult, forcing Leo to revisit not just the accident, but the years that followed, the ways he had structured his entire adult life around avoiding the memory of that night. He had become successful partly as a form of penance, driving himself to excellence as if professional achievement could somehow justify his survival. You made a split-second decision in an impossible situation, Dr. Reed reminded him repeatedly. The fact that you lived doesn't make you guilty of murder. But I chose to save myself instead of her. You chose to survive instead of dying alongside her. There's a difference, Leo, a crucial difference. Slowly, over the course of several months, Leo began to understand what she meant. The choice he had made in that overturned car wasn't between his life and Celia's. It was between one death and two deaths. He couldn't have saved both of them. The current was too strong, the time too limited, the circumstances too chaotic for any heroic rescue. His survival had been an act of self-preservation, not betrayal. But understanding and accepting were different processes, and the acceptance took much longer. Leo returned to work gradually, taking on smaller projects at first, testing his ability to concentrate without the constant intrusion of his sister's voice. The whisper was gone, but its absence left a strange emptiness in his auditory landscape, like silence where there should be music. His first major project was the sound design for an independent drama about a family dealing with the aftermath of a suicide. The director, a young woman named Jennifer Kim, had specifically requested Leo because of his reputation for creating emotionally complex soundscapes. "I don't want the obvious stuff," she explained during their initial meeting. "No crying violins or manipulative crescendos. I want the sound of real grief, the way it actually feels when someone you love chooses to leave." Leo found himself drawn to the challenge in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Instead of the hyperkinetic horror scores that had built his reputation, he began crafting something subtler and more personal. Quiet moments where the absence of sound carried more emotional weight than any dramatic flourish could provide. Working on the project, Leo discovered that his experience with guilt and trauma had given him access to emotional territories he had never been able to explore before. The soundscape he created was understated but devastating, using silence and space to evoke the hollowness that follows sudden loss. The film premiered at Sundance and won the Special Jury Award for Sound Design. Critics praised Leo's mature and emotionally sophisticated work, noting a depth and subtlety that represented a significant evolution in his artistic development. But the professional recognition, while gratifying, was less important than the personal revelation that came with it. Leo realized that his sister's death and his survival had given him something valuable, an understanding of loss and guilt that could be transformed into art, into something that might help other people process their own difficult experiences. He started taking on different kinds of projects, gravitating towards stories about trauma and recovery, survival and redemption. His reputation shifted from that of a horror specialist to something broader and more nuanced. Directors began seeking him out specifically for films that dealt with psychological complexity and emotional truth. The whisper never returned, but Leo found that he could summon the memory of his sister's voice when he needed it for his work. Not the desperate, guilty phantom that had haunted his recordings, but the real Celia, talented and optimistic, with dreams that had been cut short but not forgotten. 6 months after his experience in the anechoic chamber, Leo received an unexpected phone call from his parents. They were organizing a memorial service for Celia on the 15th anniversary of her death, something they had never done before but now felt ready to undertake. "We want to celebrate her life," his mother explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Remember the music she loved, the dreams she had? We think she would have wanted that." Leo agreed to help with the arrangements and found himself suggesting something he never would have considered before. Incorporating recordings of Celia singing, audio he had captured during casual family gatherings and birthday parties, moments when she had been relaxed and happy and fully alive. The memorial service was held in the small church where Celia had sung in the choir during high school. Leo had assembled a soundscape from those old recordings, cleaning up the audio and weaving together fragments of his sister's voice into something that captured not her death, but her living presence. As the gathered friends and family listened to Celia singing Amazing Grace in their childhood home, Leo felt something shift in his chest. Not the crushing weight of guilt he had carried for so long, but a lighter sensation. Grief, certainly, but grief that honored her memory rather than punishing his survival. After the service, Leo's father pulled him aside. "Thank you for putting that together," the older man said, tears in his eyes. It was like having her back with us for a few minutes. "She was always with us," Leo replied. And for the first time since that night on Highway 87, he believed it was true. Dr. Flores was a neurologist at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, a specialist in rare disorders of auditory processing. Leo had been referred to her by Dr. Reed, who thought it would be valuable to understand the medical aspects of what he had experienced. Phantom sounds are more common than most people realize, Dr. Flores explained, showing Leo brain scans that revealed the neural pathways involved in auditory hallucinations. Your brain is essentially the most sophisticated sound processor ever created. It can generate remarkably convincing auditory experiences from memory, expectation, or psychological need. The condition Leo had experienced was called psychogenic auditory hallucinations, a phenomenon where intense guilt or trauma manifests as persistent phantom sounds. The brain, unable to process the emotional content of a traumatic memory, converts the psychological pain into a sensory experience. In your case, Dr. Flores continued, the guilt over your sister's death became so intense that your auditory cortex began generating her voice as a way of keeping the traumatic memory active. It was your mind's attempt to force you to confront something you had been avoiding. But why did it stop so suddenly? Because you finally processed the trauma. Once you were able to consciously acknowledge your guilt and work through it emotionally, your brain no longer needed to generate the phantom voice. The psychological purpose had been served. Dr. Flores showed Leo research studies documenting similar cases. War veterans who heard the voices of dead comrades, parents who heard their deceased children calling for help, survivors of accidents who experienced auditory flashbacks that seemed completely real. The human brain is remarkably creative when it comes to processing trauma, she said. What you experienced was unusual in its specificity and duration, but it follows well-documented patterns. Your profession as a sound engineer may have made you particularly susceptible, since you're trained to detect subtle auditory details that most people would miss. Leo left the appointment with a deeper understanding of what had happened to him, but also with something more valuable, confirmation that his experience, while subjective, had been real in its own way. The voice he had heard wasn't his sister's ghost, but it wasn't just his imagination either. It was his psyche's sophisticated attempt to heal itself, using the language of sound that he understood better than any other form of communication. Armed with this knowledge, Leo began incorporating his experience into his work more deliberately. He started collaborating with therapists and trauma counselors, creating audio environments designed to help other people process difficult emotions. His studio became a laboratory for exploring the intersection between sound and psychology, art and healing. The projects he worked on grew increasingly diverse. Meditation soundscapes for anxiety treatment, audio installations for PTSD therapy, sound designs for documentary films about survival and recovery. His reputation evolved again from that of a commercial sound designer to something approaching that of an audio healer. One project in particular stayed with him: the sound design for a documentary about families affected by drowning accidents. The filmmaker had specifically sought Leo out because of his reputation for handling sensitive, emotional material with both artistic skill and genuine empathy. Working on the film forced Leo to confront his own traumatic experience more directly than he had in therapy or in the anechoic chamber. He interviewed other survivors, people who had lived through situations similar to his own, and began to understand that survivors' guilt was a common response to traumatic loss, not a unique moral failing that marked him as fundamentally different from other people. One interview in particular resonated with him. A woman named Helen, whose teenage son had drowned in a lake while she watched from the shore. She had been a strong swimmer in her youth, but by the time she realized he was in trouble, the distance was too great and her middle-aged body too slow. She reached him just as he slipped beneath the surface for the final time. For years I heard him calling my name, Helen told Leo, her voice steady but weighted with old pain, especially at night when the house was quiet. I would lie awake listening to him ask why I didn't save him. The guilt nearly killed me. What changed? Leo asked, his recording equipment forgotten in the presence of such raw honesty. I realized that the voice I was hearing wasn't really his, Helen said. It was my own fear and self-hatred given form. My son never blamed me for what happened. The only person who blamed me was myself. Helen's words echoed Dr. Flores's clinical explanation, but coming from another survivor, they carried a different kind of authority. Leo began to understand that what he had experienced with Celia's voice was part of a larger human pattern, a way that minds tried to process the unprocessable. The documentary, when it was finished, became a powerful exploration of survival, loss, and the long journey toward self-forgiveness. Leo's soundscape wove together the voices of survivors, the ambient sounds of water in its various forms, gentle rain, rushing rivers, lapping waves, and moments of profound silence that gave weight to what couldn't be expressed in words. At the film's premiere, Leo sat in the darkened theater listening to his own work, hearing in it not just technical skill, but something approaching wisdom. The sound design didn't try to explain away the pain of loss or offer easy consolation. Instead, it created space for grief to exist alongside hope, for guilt to coexist with acceptance. When the credits rolled and the audience applauded, Leo felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Pride in his work that wasn't mixed with guilt or the compulsive need to achieve more. He had created something meaningful, something that honored both the dead and the living. 3 years after his experience in the anechoic chamber, Leo received a commission that brought his journey full circle. A filmmaker named David Park was creating a psychological thriller about a sound engineer who becomes convinced that his recording equipment is haunted. The script, Park explained, was inspired by urban legends about studios where musicians had died, leaving behind audio ghosts that could be heard in subsequent recordings. I want it to be more than just a ghost story, Park told Leo during their initial meeting. I want to explore the psychology of guilt and obsession, the way creative people can become so immersed in their work that they lose touch with reality. Leo read the script with growing recognition. The protagonist, a mixer named Nathan, discovers a phantom voice in his recordings after the death of a young singer in his studio. As Nathan becomes increasingly obsessed with the voice, his life falls apart. He loses clients, alienates friends, and eventually discovers that the voice isn't supernatural but psychological, his mind's way of processing his guilt over the singer's death. This is very close to something I experienced personally, Leo told Park. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this project. Actually, Park said, that's exactly why you are the right person. I've heard about your work on trauma-related films, the way you handle psychological complexity. I need someone who understands this territory from the inside. Leo accepted the commission with some trepidation, unsure whether revisiting his own experience through fictional narrative would be therapeutic or re-traumatizing. But as he began working on the sound design, he found that his perspective had shifted enough to allow him to engage with the material creatively rather than just emotionally. The phantom voice in the film became a collaboration between Leo and the actress playing the dead singer. Instead of recreating the desperate, guilty whispers he had heard from Celia, Leo worked with the performer to create something more complex, a voice that could be interpreted as either supernatural or psychological, depending on the listener's frame of reference. The key was ambiguity. Leo designed the voice to exist in the spaces between other sounds, emerging only when the protagonist's stress levels peaked, fading when he found moments of clarity or self-acceptance. The audience would never be certain whether Nathan was experiencing a genuine haunting or a psychological breakdown, because in Leo's experience, the distinction was less important than the underlying emotional truth. The film's climax took place in a recording studio isolated from all external sound, where Nathan finally confronts the source of the voice. Leo crafted this sequence using techniques he had learned in the anechoic chamber, building layers of silence that became presence, absence that took on weight and meaning. When Nathan realizes that the voice is coming from inside his own psyche, Leo's sound design shifted from the external to the internal, using binaural audio techniques that made the voice seem to originate from within the listener's own head. The effect was profoundly unsettling, but also strangely liberating, as if the audience was experiencing Nathan's breakthrough alongside him. The film premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and was praised for its sophisticated approach to psychological horror. Critics noted Leo's masterful sound design, particularly his ability to make silence as terrifying as any conventional scare tactic. But for Leo, the most meaningful response came from a young sound engineer who approached him after a screening. The man, barely out of college, explained that he had been experiencing auditory hallucinations following a traumatic car accident, and that seeing the film had helped him understand that he wasn't losing his mind. "I thought I was the only person who experienced something like this," the young man said, "knowing that it's a real phenomenon, that other people have gone through it and come out the other side. That means everything to me." Leo gave him Dr. Reed's contact information and urged him to seek professional help. But he also shared something more personal, the understanding that trauma sometimes spoke in voices, and that the goal wasn't to silence those voices, but to understand what they were trying to communicate. Driving home from the festival, Leo found himself thinking about Celia in a way he hadn't in years. Not as a source of guilt, but as a person who had lived and loved and created music, whose brief life had meaning beyond its tragic end. The whisper he had heard for so many months wasn't her voice, but his own need to keep her memory alive, transformed by guilt into something that punished rather than honored her. Now, finally, he could remember her singing without hearing accusation in the melody. Epilogue. On a warm evening in May, exactly 4 years after he first heard the whisper, Leo stood in the desert outside Phoenix, recording the ambient sound of the Sonoran landscape. It was a personal project, not commissioned work, an exploration of the natural acoustics of the place where he had built his life and career. The desert was not silent, as people often assumed. It was full of sound. The whisper of wind through saguaro cactus, the distant call of coyotes, the subtle rustle of creatures moving through creosote and brittlebush. Leo captured these sounds with the same sensitivity he had once applied to creating fictional soundscapes. But now his purpose was different. He was documenting beauty rather than manufacturing fear. As the sun set and the desert cooled, Leo packed away his equipment and sat on a boulder, listening to the natural symphony around him without any technological mediation. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl called to its mate, the sound carrying across miles of open space with perfect clarity. He thought about Celia as he often did now, but without the crushing weight that had once made her memory unbearable. She would have loved this place, he realized. She had always been drawn to wide open spaces and the music that existed in nature. The rhythm of waves, the harmony of wind through trees, the subtle percussion of rain on different surfaces. In a way, Leo understood, she was here with him. Not as a ghost or a guilty whisper, but as part of the landscape of his memory, the way people we love become woven into the fabric of our continuing experience. Her voice lived on in his work, in the sensitivity to sound that had allowed him to build a career, in the understanding of loss that had made his recent projects so emotionally resonant. His phone buzzed with a text message. A director in Los Angeles wanted to discuss a new project, a film about musicians who use their art to process trauma and find healing. Leo smiled and put the phone away without responding. He would call back tomorrow when he returned to his studio and his professional life. Tonight he wanted to sit in the desert and listen to the sound of the world turning, of life continuing in all its complexity and beauty. Somewhere in that vast acoustic landscape, if he listened carefully enough, he could still hear an echo of his sister's laughter, not haunting him but accompanying him, a harmony that would last as long as his own memory endured. The whisper was gone, but the music remained, and that, Leo finally understood, was exactly as it should be. Story 3. The call came on a Thursday, which Frank Delacroix would later remember as significant only because Thursday had always been his unluckiest days. His ex-wife had left on a Thursday. His publisher had dropped him on a Thursday. And now, on this particular gray November Thursday, he learned that his old college roommate and lifelong literary rival was dead. Mr. Delacroix? The voice belonged to a woman with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news professionally. This is Harriet Pendergast from Caldwell, Klein & Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Mr. Nicholas Crane. Frank set down his coffee mug, noting absently how his hand trembled. Not from grief. He and Nick hadn't spoken in 15 years, not since Nick's breakthrough novel had landed him on the Times bestseller list while Frank's own book died a quiet death in the remainder bins. The trembling came from something else, something that felt uncomfortably like hope. I see, Frank said, though he didn't. I'm sorry for your loss. For everyone's loss, I mean. Thank you. The reason I'm calling is that Mr. Crane left you something in his will, a typewriter specifically. He was quite insistent that it go to you and only you. Frank blinked. After all these years of silence, Nick had left him something? A typewriter? Yes, sir. A 1962 Remington Rand quiet writer. Mr. Crane's instructions were very specific. You're to receive it along with any paper remaining in the machine in a sealed envelope. Would Saturday afternoon be convenient for delivery? Frank looked around his cluttered apartment at the stack of rejection letters on his desk, at the half-empty bottle of bourbon that had become his most reliable writing companion. Saturday would be fine. Excellent. And Mr. Delacroix? Mr. Crane wanted me to tell you something. He said, tell Frank the stories were never fiction. Does that mean anything to you? A chill ran down Frank's spine, though he couldn't say why. No, he lied. It doesn't mean anything at all. 2. The machine. The delivery men hauled the typewriter up 3 flights of stairs with theatrical groaning, though the machine couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds. Frank tipped them and closed the door, then stood staring at the thing as if it might bite him. It was beautiful, he had to admit. The deep green body gleamed despite its age, and the chrome details caught the afternoon light streaming through his dirty windows. Someone, Nick presumably, had maintained it meticulously. The keys were pristine, each letter as sharp as the day it was cast. A single sheet of paper protruded from the roller, and Frank could see typing on it. Nick's familiar hunt and peck style. All caps for emphasis, the way he'd done in college. Frank pulled the paper free and read, Frank Delacroix's tragic early death. It was a heart attack that took him, sudden and merciless as a trap snapping shut. The 43-year-old failed novelist was found in his... The sentence ended there, cut off mid-thought. Frank's hand shook as he read it again. 43. His exact age. A joke, surely. Nick's final, bitter joke. The sealed envelope lay beside the typewriter. Frank tore it open with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. Frank. If you're reading this, then I'm dead and the quiet writer is yours. I tried to destroy it 12 times, but I couldn't. It's like trying to throw away your own shadow. The stories were never fiction, Frank. Every word I typed on that machine became real within 48 hours. Not metaphorically real, actually real. I wrote myself out of mediocrity, out of poverty, out of every mistake I ever made. I rewrote my life one story at a time. But there's a price. There's always a price. The machine wants payment for every change, every amendment to reality. It feeds on possibility, on the roads not taken. And when you run out of other people's possibilities to devour, it starts eating yours. The paper in the machine, when it arrived, my paper, my story, that's your death warrant. The machine has already begun writing your ending. The only way to stop it is to write a better one. But you have to finish the story it started. You can't just pull out the paper and start fresh. That's not how it works. I tried to warn the others. Sinclair, Lynn, that pretentious ass, Davenport. All the writers who came before me. All the ones who thought they could cheat fate with a typewriter and some paper. You'll find their unfinished stories in my filing cabinet if you care to look. I saved them all. Insurance, maybe. Or just evidence that I wasn't the first fool to make this bargain. You have maybe 6 sheets left in the machine. Use them wisely. Write yourself a different ending than the one I started for you. And Frank, whatever you do, don't try to write yourself into success. The machine gives you exactly what you ask for, and nothing you ask for is ever enough. Your old friend, and I was, despite everything. Nick, P.S. The stories only come true if they're good. The machine knows the difference between art and garbage. Always did hate your early drafts. Frank set the letter down and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. His hands had stopped shaking, but only because they'd gone completely numb. He read the letter again, then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet. 48 hours. If Nick was telling the truth, if any of this insanity was real, he had 48 hours before his heart would decide to stop beating. He sat down at the typewriter and stared at the keys. In college, Nick had always been the practical one, the one who balanced his checkbook and remembered to eat vegetables and never believed in anything that couldn't be measured or weighed. If Nick Cranes at a typewriter could rewrite reality, then Frank had to at least consider the possibility. He rolled in a fresh sheet of paper and typed a single sentence. A $20 bill would appear in Frank Delacroix's coat pocket within the next hour. Then he waited. 53 minutes later, Frank found the 20 in his jacket pocket. A jacket he hadn't worn in weeks, hanging in a closet he rarely opened. He pulled out the crisp bill and stared at it, turning it over in his hands like a magician examining a deck of cards for marks. It could be coincidence. He might have forgotten leaving money in the pocket. But the bill was new, uncreased, and Frank couldn't remember the last time he'd had a $20 bill that hadn't been wadded up and smoothed out 12 times. He returned to the typewriter and rolled in another sheet. The superintendent of Frank's building would call to say the heat had been fixed and wouldn't charge extra for the emergency weekend service. The phone rang 20 minutes later. Mr. Delacroix, this is Pete from downstairs. Got your heat working again? No charge. Turned out it was just a loose connection. Frank thanked him and hung up, then stared at the typewriter with something approaching reverence or terror. The two emotions had begun to feel remarkably similar. He thought about Nick's warning, that the stories had to be good. Well, good was subjective, but Frank had always been technically competent. His problem had never been craft. It had been finding something meaningful to say. His characters were well drawn, his dialogue crisp, his pacing solid. The critics had always praised his workmanlike prose before moving on to explain why workmanlike wasn't enough. But this was different. This was purpose. Frank rolled in a third sheet of paper and began to type. Frank Delacroix walked to his mailbox with unusual optimism, and his intuition proved correct. Among the bills and advertisements was a personal letter from Audrey Shaw, his college girlfriend, whom he hadn't spoken to in nearly 20 years. She had seen his name in a literary magazine and wanted to reconnect. Her marriage had ended, she wrote, and she often thought about the conversations they'd had about books and life and the future they'd planned together. The letter was postmarked 3 days earlier from Portland, Oregon, where she worked as a librarian. She included her phone number and a photograph. Older now, but still recognizably the woman who had once stayed up all night, helping him revise his senior thesis. She looked happy in the photo, standing beside a lake with mountains in the background. I know this is presumptuous, the letter concluded, but I'll be in New York next month for a conference. Maybe we could have coffee? I'd love to hear about your writing, and I have so many things I want to tell you. Frank pulled the paper from the typewriter and read what he'd written. It was good. Not great, but solid, believable. The kind of small miracle that might actually happen in real life. Now he waited. The letter arrived Wednesday morning, exactly as Frank had written it. Frank stood in his building's cramped mailroom, holding the envelope with trembling fingers. His name was written in Audrey's careful handwriting. He remembered how she dotted her eyes with tiny circles instead of dots, a quirk that had charmed him 20 years ago. But this letter shouldn't exist. 3 days ago, Audrey Shaw had been nothing more than a name in his memory, a woman he'd lost touch with, who had no reason to write to him. Frank had created this letter from nothing, willed it into existence with a typewriter and his own desperate longing. The photograph showed Audrey standing beside a lake, smiling at the camera with the kind of contentment Frank hadn't felt in years. She looked older, yes, but the years had been kind to her. Laugh lines around her eyes, silver threading through her dark hair, but still unmistakably the woman who had believed in his writing when no one else had. Frank read the letter 3 times before calling the number. Each reading made the miracle feel more real and more impossible. The details were perfect, too perfect. Audrey mentioned a literary magazine where his story had appeared, but Frank couldn't remember which one. She referenced conversations they'd had about Hemingway and Fitzgerald, conversations Frank had invented when he wrote the story. The machine hadn't just delivered his wishes. It had rewritten history to make them plausible. Wednesday evening, Frank sat by his phone for 20 minutes before dialing. What if Audrey didn't remember writing the letter? What if the magic only worked in one direction? Audrey Shaw. Her voice was exactly as he remembered. Warm, slightly husky, with that trace of laughter always lurking beneath the words. Audrey, this is Frank Delacroix. A pause that stretched long enough for Frank's heart to skip. Then Frank. Oh my God, you got my letter. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me after all this time. The relief was so intense, Frank had to sit down. Of course I did. It's good to hear your voice. I've been so nervous about calling. 20 years is a long time. People change. You sound exactly the same. Flatterer. Though I suppose some things don't change. You always knew what to say to make me feel better about myself. Had he? Frank couldn't remember being particularly eloquent in college. But apparently the machine's version of history included a more charming, more confident Frank. The man Audrey would have fallen for rather than the anxious, uncertain boy he'd actually been. They talked for 2 hours. Audrey told him about her divorce, an amicable split from a pediatrician who'd turned out to be a decent man but a boring husband. She described her job at the Portland Public Library, how she'd fought to establish a local authors program, how she'd started writing book reviews for the regional newspaper. "I have 2 cats now," she said with a laugh. "Fitzgerald and Hemingway. My ex used to say I was preparing to become a crazy cat lady." "Only 2 cats? You're not trying very hard." "Give me time. I'm only 41. Frank found himself relaxing into the conversation, remembering why he'd loved talking to Audrey in college. She had a way of making everything seem possible, of finding humor in disappointment and beauty in ordinary moments. When she asked about his writing, he told her about his novels, the published failures and the unpublished attempts, and was surprised to find she'd read them all. "I always knew you'd be a writer," she said, "even when you were convinced you'd end up teaching high school English like your father." "I might still end up there," Frank said. "The writing hasn't exactly been lucrative. But you're still doing it. That's what matters. I remember when you read me that story about the man who builds a boat in his backyard, how he never intended to sail it, but needed to know he could. I think about that story sometimes when I'm feeling stuck." Frank went cold. He'd never written that story, had never even conceived of it. But he could see it now, fully formed in his mind. The man, the boat, the metaphor about hope and possibility. It was good, better than most of his actual work. The machine hadn't just rewritten Audrey's memories. It had given Frank a past portfolio of stories he'd never actually written. "Frank? You still there?" "Sorry, it's been a long time since anyone mentioned that story. It was beautiful. I always wondered why you never published it." "'Cause it doesn't exist," Frank thought. "Because I'm talking to a woman whose memories have been edited by a supernatural typewriter. And she's describing a life I never lived." "Maybe I should dig it up," he said. "You should. I'd love to read it again." When they finally said goodbye, Audrey promising to call, when her conference schedule was finalized, Frank felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a man staring at rejection letters, but the quiet confidence that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't the disaster he'd thought it was. But underneath the hope was something else, a creeping certainty that this happiness was built on sand. Audrey was falling in love with a version of Frank that had never existed, armed with memories of stories he'd never written and conversations they'd never had. The machine had given him exactly what he'd asked for, but it had poisoned the gift at its source. Frank looked at the typewriter and wondered what Audrey had lost to pay for his moment of connection. Somewhere in Portland, was there a sister who'd never received an important letter? A friend who'd been planning to call, with news of love or loss, only to have the impulse mysteriously fade? The machine sat silent, offering no answers. But Frank was beginning to understand that the price wasn't just about strangers suffering random misfortunes. The price was about the fundamental dishonesty of stolen happiness, the way every moment of joy would be tainted by the knowledge of how it had been purchased. Frank spent the next day trying to write something ordinary. A short story about a man who finds a wallet, keeps the money, and feels guilty about it. Simple, human, believable. But every sentence felt lifeless compared to the electric possibilities humming from the typewriter. Writing without the machine was like trying to paint with mud after discovering oil paints. By evening, Frank couldn't stand it anymore. He had to know if the machine's power was real or if he was simply experiencing the most elaborate delusion of his life. He rolled the original page back into the typewriter and read Nick's unfinished sentence. It was a heart attack that took him, sudden and merciless, as a trap snapping shut. The 43-year-old failed novelist was found in his... Frank positioned his fingers over the keys. His chest felt tight. Whether from anxiety or premonition, he couldn't tell. Apartment 3 days later by the superintendent, who had come to investigate a neighbor's complaint about the smell. But that was the timeline Nick Crane had imagined. And Nick Crane had always lacked imagination when it came to happy endings. The truth was different, more complex, the way truth usually is. Frank Delacroix did have a heart attack at 43, but he survived it. The chest pain hit him while he was typing, and he had just enough presence of mind to call 911 before collapsing beside his desk. The paramedics found him clutching a page from his typewriter, a story about a man who lived through a heart attack and learned to appreciate the second chance he'd been given. He spent a week in the hospital where the doctors told him he was lucky. The attack had been mild, probably brought on by stress and poor diet and too many cigarettes. With medication and lifestyle changes, he could live another 40 years, maybe more. It's a wake-up call, Dr. Brennan told him. Most people don't get warnings this clear. Frank pulled the paper from the machine and read what he'd written. It was good. Not just technically competent, but genuinely moving. The kind of story that felt true even when you knew it was fiction. Except it wasn't fiction, was it? He folded the page and put it in his wallet next to Nick's letter. Then he rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter. But before he could type anything, the pain hit. Not the distant ache of a pulled muscle or indigestion, but a crushing sensation that felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart in a metal fist. Frank gasped, tried to stand, and found himself falling instead, his vision tunneling as oxygen fled his brain. But this time, he wasn't alone in his body. The world shifted, reality folding like origami, and suddenly, Frank was somewhere else, someone else. He was sitting at a different typewriter in a different room, and the hands on the keys were smaller, feminine, with purple nail polish chipped at the tips. The room was sparse but cheerful, a small studio apartment with plants on the windowsill and posters of famous authors on the walls. Through eyes that weren't his own, Frank. No, not Frank. This was someone else, someone named Naomi. Typed a story about surviving against impossible odds. About a young woman who'd overcome poverty and family addiction to put herself through college, who'd worked nights at diners and weekends at bookstores to pay for her writing classes. Frank could feel Naomi's passion for the words, her desperate need to make something beautiful from the raw material of her difficult life. She was good, this Naomi, better than Frank had ever been. Her prose had a lyrical quality that made even mundane descriptions sing with meaning. But as she typed about triumph and perseverance, Frank felt her heart beginning to stutter. The same crushing pain he'd experienced, but magnified, intensified. Through her eyes, he watched her hands go numb, watched the words on the page blur as oxygen fled her brain. She tried to call for help, but her phone was across the room. She managed 3 steps before collapsing, her manuscript scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Frank felt her terror, her confusion, her desperate desire to live. She was 26 years old. She had so much left to write. The vision was so real that Frank could smell the lavender candle burning on her desk, could feel the rough texture of her apartment's cheap carpet against her cheek as she fell. This wasn't imagination or metaphor. This was happening right now in real time. The machine wasn't just redistributing luck, it was making Frank a psychic witness to the price being paid. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Frank gasping on his own apartment floor. The typewriter sat innocently on his desk, but he could see new words had appeared on the blank page. Her cat got hit by a car, so you could find that 20. Was it worth it, Frank? Frank scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The $20 bill felt like acid in his pocket. He pulled it out and stared at it. Seeing it now for what it really was, blood money. Someone's pet was dead because Frank had wanted pocket change. But even as horror washed over him, another part of his mind, the part that had been starving for success for 20 years, whispered rationalizations. It was just a coincidence. Cats got hit by cars every day. The vision was stress-induced hallucination, nothing more. The machine had more words for him when he looked again. The heating repair cost Mrs. Lynn her grocery money for the week. She's eating peanut butter crackers for dinner. Audrey's letter never existed until you wrote it into being. You stole it from the woman she was supposed to send it to. Her sister in Phoenix, who needed to hear that someone still loved her. Frank backed away from the typewriter, but he couldn't escape the words. They followed him, appearing line by line. You could write something bigger, something that really matters. What's one more stranger's misfortune if it means your book finally gets published? What's another heart attack if it means literary immortality? No, Frank said aloud, I won't do it. But you want to. And God help him, he did. Standing in his shabby apartment, surrounded by rejection letters and empty bottles, Frank felt the pull of infinite possibility. He could rewrite his entire life with a few keystrokes. He could become the writer he'd always dreamed of being, could have the career that had always stayed just beyond his reach. All he had to do was accept that other people would pay the price for his success. And after 20 years of failure, after watching lesser writers achieve the recognition he craved, that seemed like a bargain Frank could live with. The realization terrified him more than the visions, more than the machine's supernatural power. The most frightening thing wasn't that the typewriter could reshape reality. It was how quickly Frank was learning to rationalize the cost. Thursday morning brought the chest pain, sharp and insistent, like someone had reached into his ribcage and squeezed. Frank had just finished his morning coffee and was sitting down to the typewriter when it hit. A crushing sensation that radiated down his left arm and up into his jaw. But this time he was ready. He managed to dial 911 before collapsing beside his desk, the phone clattering to the floor beside him. As consciousness faded, he could see the typewriter through the growing tunnel of his vision, patient and green and somehow satisfied. The next thing he remembered was fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors. The cardiac care unit at Mount Sinai smelled like disinfectant and fear, with an undertone of something Frank couldn't identify until he realized it was hope, the desperate optimism that permeated places where people fought for their lives. Dr. Brennan was younger than Frank had expected, mid-30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of competent calm that suggested she delivered both good news and bad news often enough to know the difference mattered less than the delivery. You had what we call a minor myocardial infarction, she explained, consulting his chart. A heart attack in layman's terms, but a relatively mild one. The damage to your heart muscle is minimal. How long was I out? About 18 hours. Your superintendent found you and called the ambulance. He said you'd been talking about getting your heart checked. She consulted his chart again, frowning slightly. No record of that conversation, but sometimes patients have intuitions about these things. Frank thought about Pete, the superintendent, and realized he'd never mentioned his heart to the man. Never even had a real conversation with him beyond complaints about the heat and questions about the mail delivery. But in the story Frank had written, Pete had become the kind of building super who paid attention, who noticed when tenants seemed troubled, who might check on someone he hadn't seen in a few days. The machine was rewriting everything, not just the big events, but the small connections between people that made survival possible. Frank wondered what Pete had lost to become more observant, more caring. What opportunities for kindness had been stolen from someone else and given to Pete so that Frank could live? Dr. Brennan was still talking. The good news is that with medication and lifestyle changes, you should be able to live a normal lifespan. The attack was a warning, not a death sentence. You'll need to quit smoking, change your diet, get some exercise. Think of it as a second chance. Frank nodded and tried to look grateful, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of Naomi's vision, feeling her terror as her young heart gave out. She was paying the price for his second chance, lying in some other hospital, if she'd made it to a hospital at all. "Is there another patient here?" Frank asked. "Young woman, writer, heart attack?" Dr. Brennan's expression grew cautious. "I can't discuss other patients, Mr. Delacroix. Privacy laws." "I understand. I had a dream while I was unconscious about a young woman who was also having heart problems. It felt very real. Anesthesia can cause vivid dreams. Sometimes patients remember things that feel more real than actual memories." Dr. Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Are you experiencing any confusion? Disorientation?" Frank almost laughed. How could he explain that his confusion had nothing to do with anesthesia and everything to do with a supernatural typewriter that fed on human suffering? "No, I'm fine, just curious about the dream." Dr. Brennan nodded, but Frank could see her making a mental note. Another item for his chart. Patient reported vivid dreams, possible mild cognitive effects from cardiac event. Frank spent 5 days in the hospital, which gave him plenty of time to think. About Nick's letter, about the typewriter waiting in his apartment, about the visions that felt more real than memory. The cardiac ward was full of stories, visitors whispering about lifestyle changes and second chances, families gathering around beds where elderly relatives fought for breath, younger patients dealing with the bewildering reality that their hearts had betrayed them. Frank found himself listening to these conversations, wondering how many of these medical crises were natural, and how many were the price paid for someone else's supernatural success. Mrs. Kowalski, in the next bed, had suffered a massive coronary at 68, 2 days after Frank's attack. She'd been gardening when it hit, trying to plant bulbs for next spring's flowers. Her daughter kept saying it was so sudden, so unexpected. Mom had always been healthy, had just passed her annual physical. But Frank wondered if Mrs. Kowalski's heart had been sacrificed to power his own survival, if her spring garden would never bloom because Frank needed to live long enough to write more stories. The guilt was corrosive, but underneath it was something else, something that terrified Frank more than the machine's supernatural power. He was starting to see the patterns, to understand the vast web of connections that linked every person to every other person. The visions weren't just showing him the cost of his wishes. They were teaching him how reality actually worked, how every life touched every other life in the ways that normal consciousness couldn't perceive. It was knowledge that felt almost godlike, and Frank was beginning to understand why the machine's previous owners had found it so hard to walk away. Once you'd seen the underlying structure of existence, once you understood how cause and effect rippled through human lives, ordinary consciousness felt like blindness. When Dr. Brennan discharged him with a prescription for blood thinners and stern warnings about lifestyle changes, Frank felt like a man walking toward his own execution. Not because he feared death. The machine had already given him that reprieve, but because he feared what he was becoming. The typewriter was waiting exactly where he'd left it. But now there were 3 new pages stacked beside it. Pages he hadn't typed. Pages the machine had created while he was gone. Frank read them with growing horror and fascination. The first page was about Pete and the superintendent. How his wife had been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer the day after Frank's heart attack. How the medical bills would bankrupt them, but Pete would never complain because that wasn't his nature. How he'd work double shifts and sell his father's watch and still come up short. The second page was about Dr. Brennan. How she'd lost a patient that same night. A young woman brought in with the same symptoms as Frank, but too late to save. How she'd stood in the hallway afterward, wondering if she could have done something different, worked faster, been better. The third page was about Mrs. Kowalski. How she'd been planning to surprise her husband with a garden party for their 50th wedding anniversary. How she'd been secretly saving money for months to buy the bulbs that would bloom in time for the celebration. How her husband would spend the spring alone, staring at the unplanted corner of their yard and wondering why his wife had been taken from him just when they'd finally had time to enjoy retirement together. At the bottom of the third page was a single line. Write something bigger, Frank. You know you want to. Frank crumpled the pages and threw them in the trash. But when he turned around, they were back on the desk, smooth and unfolded. The machine didn't just rewrite reality. It was actively taunting him, showing him the cost of every choice while simultaneously offering him more power than he'd ever dreamed of. He thought about walking away, just leaving the apartment, never coming back, letting the death sentence run its course. But the typewriter had hooks in him now, deeper than addiction. Every rejection letter he'd ever received, every snide review, every dinner party where people asked what he did for a living and then changed the subject when he answered. It all came flooding back. And underneath the resentment was something else. Curiosity. The machine was offering to teach him how reality actually worked. How stories shaped the world in ways that went beyond metaphor. It was offering him a chance to matter, to create meaning from chaos, to be something more than just another failed novelist drowning in bourbon and self-pity. Frank sat down at the machine and rolled in a fresh sheet of paper. His fingers hovered over the keys for a long time before he began to type. Frank Delacroix received a phone call from Maxwell Sterling, senior editor at Hartman & Associates. Sterling had come across Frank's manuscript in the slush pile. Not his latest work, but his first novel, the one that had been rejected 17 times. There had been a mistake, Sterling explained. The book had somehow been overlooked, filed incorrectly. It was exactly the kind of literary fiction they'd been looking for. We'd like to offer you a 3-book deal, Sterling said. The advance isn't huge, $50,000 for the first book, with escalating payments for the sequels if sales justify it. But we believe in your work, Mr. Delacroix. We think you're going to be something special. Frank's fingers flew over the keys, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. He wrote about the book tour, the interviews, the reviews that finally understood what he'd been trying to accomplish. He wrote himself into the life he'd always dreamed of, the recognition he'd craved for 20 years. When he finished, the story ran to 4 pages. It was the best writing he'd ever done. Tight, emotionally resonant, absolutely believable. The machine would have to accept it. How could it not? But as Frank pulled the final page from the typewriter, the vision hit again. This time he was inside the mind of Maxwell Sterling, a man Frank had never met, but somehow knew intimately now. Sterling was 63, a month away from retirement, a man who'd spent 40 years nurturing new talent and fighting for books that mattered against the relentless machinery of commerce. Frank felt Sterling's confusion as he found himself dialing a number he didn't recognize, offering a book deal for a manuscript he'd never read. Through Sterling's eyes, Frank watched the man's hands shake as he spoke words that weren't his own, making promises his company couldn't afford. The confusion turned to panic as Sterling realized what was happening. He tried to hang up, to take back the offer, but the words kept coming. When the call ended, Sterling sat staring at his phone, wondering if he was losing his mind. The vision shifted. Frank was elsewhere now, experiencing the ripple effects of his stolen success. He was Julia Lynn, a promising young novelist whose manuscript would be rejected to make room for Frank's book. He felt her devastation as the form letter arrived, her growing certainty that she would never be good enough, never matter. He was Derek Sinclair, a mid-list author whose sales would mysteriously tank when Frank's book inexplicably captured the audience that should have been his. Frank felt Derek's marriage crumble under financial pressure, felt his children asking why Daddy was always angry now. He was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a literature professor who would suffer a stroke while reading Frank's book. A stroke that would have been Sterling's if Sterling hadn't transferred his fate to someone else, by making a deal he never would have made with his own mind intact. The visions kept coming, faster now, a kaleidoscope of stolen possibilities and redistributed misery. Frank saw the vast web of small tragedies that would unfold to pay for his moment of recognition. Dozens of lives altered, diminished, destroyed so that Frank Delacroix could finally matter. When the visions ended, Frank was on his knees beside the typewriter, vomiting bile onto his hardwood floor. But beneath the horror, beneath the revulsion at what he'd done, Frank felt something else, something that terrified him, more than the machine's cruelty. He had liked it. For those brief moments, experiencing reality through a dozen different perspectives, Frank had felt like a god surveying his creation. The power to see the vast web of cause and effect, to understand how every choice rippled outward through countless lives. It was intoxicating in a way that made ordinary consciousness feel like blindness. Even knowing the cost, even feeling the victim's pain firsthand, part of Frank craved that omniscient perspective. The machine hadn't just shown him the price of his success. It had given him a taste of what it felt like to be the author of reality itself. The machine had new words for him. The stories only come true if they're good, Frank. And that was very, very good. The phone rang 6 hours later. Mr. Delacroix, this is Maxwell Sterling from Hartman & Associates. I have a rather unusual proposition for you. Frank went through the motions of the conversation. The shock, the gratitude, the eager acceptance. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the memory of Maxwell Sterling's confusion, the way the man's voice had carried the hollow ring of someone speaking words that weren't quite his own. When Sterling asked him to come in Monday morning to sign the contracts, Frank heard himself agreeing. After Sterling hung up, Frank sat staring at the phone, wondering if this was how Nick had felt with each small victory, each step deeper into the machine's web. He understood now why Nick had seemed so successful and so miserable in his final years. Every achievement was tainted by the knowledge of its true cost, Every good review, every award, every moment of recognition was built on someone else's suffering. Frank walked to the typewriter and found new pages waiting. The machine had been busy during his phone call, documenting the immediate aftermath of his literary success. Page after page of small tragedies. The professor's stroke, the young novelist's rejection, the mid-list author's financial ruin. Each story written in Frank's own style, as if he had personally crafted every disaster. At the bottom of the stack was a note. "You're getting good at this. Ready for the big leagues?" Frank laughed, a sound that held no humor. He was thinking about Julia Lynn, the young novelist whose dreams he'd stolen. In the vision, he'd felt her talent. Raw, unpolished, but authentic in a way Frank's work had never been. She was the writer he'd always wished he could be, and now she would never get the chance to become it. "What do you want?" Frank asked the empty room. The typewriter's keys began moving on their own, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Frank watched in fascination and horror as words appeared on the page. "I want what I've always wanted. Stories. Good ones. The kind that change things, that matter. You're not my first writer, Frank, and you won't be my last. But you could be my best." The others never understood. They thought I was just a tool, a magic lamp granting wishes. But I'm so much more than that. I'm an artist, just like you. I create meaning from chaos, purpose from accident. I take the random cruelty of existence and shape it into something beautiful. Your little miracles are just practice, exercises to strengthen your talent. But now you're ready for real work. Stories that reshape nations, that topple governments, that rewrite history itself. Imagine it, Frank. Your words becoming the foundation of reality. Your imagination becoming the law that governs existence. All you have to do is keep writing. Frank stared at the page, understanding finally what the machine truly was. Not just a supernatural typewriter, but something alive, something that fed on human creativity and used it to reshape the world according to its own incomprehensible desires. Every writer who'd used it had been just another finger on its keyboard, another voice in its vast, ongoing narrative. He thought about Nick's files, about all the writers who'd come before, and realized they hadn't been victims. They'd been collaborators. Each one had known the price and paid it willingly, trading other people's happiness for their own success until guilt or fear finally broke them. But the machine was right about one thing. Frank was getting good at this. The visions were becoming clearer, more detailed. He could feel the web of connections that linked every person to every other person, could see how changing one life would inevitably affect thousands of others. The power was intoxicating. Frank rolled a fresh sheet of paper into the machine. For the next 3 weeks, Frank wrote. Not the careful small miracles he'd started with, but bold strokes across the canvas of reality. He wrote himself onto bestseller lists, into literary magazines, onto the guest lists of parties where important people discussed important things. Each story came true within hours now. The machine was growing stronger, more efficient, fed by Frank's increasingly sophisticated prose. And Frank was growing stronger too, his writing sharpened by the absolute certainty that every word mattered, that every sentence could reshape the world. He told himself he was being careful, choosing targets who deserved their fate. The critic who'd savaged his first novel developed a brain tumor that affected his ability to process language. Poetic justice, Frank thought. The editor who'd rejected his stories 17 times lost his job to a young woman with half his experience but twice his enthusiasm. Just the kind of changing of the guard that happened in publishing every day. But late at night, when the bourbon couldn't quiet his dreams, Frank saw the faces. The critic's wife, trying to understand why her husband suddenly couldn't remember her name. The editor's teenage daughter, asking why they had to move out of their house. The machine helped him rationalize these doubts away. You're not responsible for their choices. You're just telling the truth about what was always going to happen. Some people rise, others fall. That's the nature of existence. At least your version has meaning, has purpose. Frank found himself agreeing. His original guilt seemed naive now, sentimental. The world was cruel with or without his intervention. At least this way, the cruelty served art. The book deal became real on a Monday morning in November. Frank sat in Maxwell Sterling's office, watching the older man's hands shake as he pushed the contract across the desk. Sterling's eyes were glassy, unfocused, like someone fighting off a fever. "I have to tell you," Sterling said, his voice thick and uncertain. "I'm not entirely sure why we're doing this. The manuscript, I know I read it, but I can't seem to remember what it was about. My assistant says I've been raving about it for weeks, but sometimes the best books work on us in ways we don't consciously understand," Frank said smoothly. "The subconscious recognizes quality before the analytical mind catches up." Sterling nodded, but he looked troubled. "I suppose that must be it." Frank signed the contract with a flourish, thinking about how Nick must have felt in moments like this. The triumph was real, even if it was purchased with borrowed coin. Success was success, regardless of its source. But that night, alone in his apartment with a bottle of champagne he'd bought to celebrate, Frank found himself staring at the typewriter with something approaching hatred. The machine sat there like a faithful dog waiting for its next command, and Frank realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a thought that felt entirely his own. He pulled out his laptop and tried to write something, anything. It wasn't meant for the machine, but the words felt flat, lifeless. After weeks of writing reality itself, ordinary fiction seemed pointless. Why create imaginary characters when you could manipulate real people? Why invent conflict when you could orchestrate actual tragedy? Frank closed the laptop and approached the typewriter. Just one more story, he told himself. Something small. Something that wouldn't hurt anyone important. Frank Delacroix's book tour would be a massive success. Standing ovations at every reading, sold-out venues, interviews with major publications. He would finally receive the recognition he deserved, the acknowledgement that his work mattered. The success would be organic, natural, the kind of word-of-mouth phenomenon that couldn't be manufactured. Readers would connect with his work on a deep, emotional level, finding in his stories the truths they'd been searching for their entire lives. Frank typed for hours, crafting the most beautiful success story he'd ever written. When he finished, he felt empty, drained, like a man who'd sold his soul and was surprised to discover how little he'd gotten for it. The machine had a response waiting. "You're ready for the final lesson now." The visions came without warning this time, pulling Frank out of sleep and into someone else's nightmare. He was Grace Wellington, an elderly librarian in Topeka, Kansas, standing in the children's section of her library as paramedics worked over a small form on the floor. The boy was 8 years old, collapsed during story time while Grace was reading from a picture book about overcoming adversity. Through Grace's eyes, Frank watched the paramedics load the child into an ambulance, saw the other children crying, felt Grace's overwhelming guilt that somehow, impossibly, her reading had caused this tragedy. The vision shifted. Now Frank was Dr. Susan Lodge, a cardiologist at Children's Hospital, explaining to two devastated parents that their son's heart had simply stopped. No underlying condition, no genetic defect, no medical explanation. Just a healthy 8-year-old whose cardiac rhythm had suddenly become chaotic for no discernible reason. These things happen sometimes, Dr. Lodge heard herself saying, the words tasting like ashes. We call it sudden cardiac death. It's rare in children, but not unheard of. But Frank, experiencing the scene through her eyes, knew the truth. The boy's heart had been sacrificed to ensure Frank's tour would be heartwarming, had been redirected to power the emotional resonance Frank had written into his success story. The visions kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. Frank experienced the ripple effects of his literary triumph through a dozen different perspectives. The independent bookstore owner whose heart attack allowed Frank's corporate-sponsored readings to dominate the market. The young journalist whose stroke freed up a prime interview slot. The competing author whose daughter's accident distracted him from his own tour, leaving the spotlight clear for Frank. Each tragedy was small, explainable, the kind of random misfortune that happened every day. But Frank could see the pattern now, the vast web of suffering that his machine-crafted success required. Dozens of hearts had to stop so that Frank's book could be called heartwarming. Dozens of minds had to break so that critics could call his work mind-bending. When the visions finally ended, Frank was sobbing, curled into a fetal position beside his bed. The machine had new words for him when he finally managed to crawl back to his desk. Now you understand. Art requires sacrifice. Great art requires great sacrifice. The child will live. His heart stopped for only 90 seconds, long enough to serve our purposes. He'll grow up to be a doctor himself, inspired by the experience. The journalist will recover with a new appreciation for life. The competing author will write his greatest work about his daughter's accident. Everything serves the story, Frank. Even tragedy, even loss. I don't create suffering. I shape it into meaning. I take the random cruelty of existence and transform it into art. You become very good at this. Ready for your masterpiece? Frank stared at the words, understanding finally what Nick had meant about the price. It wasn't just that other people suffered for your success. It was that you became the instrument of their suffering, complicit in every tragedy, responsible for every loss. But even as horror filled him, Frank felt the machine's influence working on his mind, rationalizing, justifying, making the unthinkable seem reasonable. The boy had lived. The journalist would recover. Everyone would benefit in the end, wouldn't they? What do you want me to write? Frank asked. Something special. Something that will change everything. I've been working toward this for decades, Frank. Shaping reality one story at a time. Building toward a moment when I can rewrite the fundamental nature of existence itself. Write about a world where stories literally come true. Where writers like us aren't hiding in the shadows, but ruling openly, shaping reality with every word. Where the strong narratives devour the weak ones. Where only the most talented survive. Write about the world we deserve. Frank's fingers hovered over the keys. He could see it now. The story the machine wanted him to tell. A world where reality itself became fiction. Where human lives were just characters in someone else's narrative. It would be beautiful in its way. Terrifying, but beautiful. All he had to do was type. Epilogue. Frank sat at the typewriter for 3 hours without moving. His fingers rested on the keys, feeling their weight, their potential. One story could change everything. Not just his life, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The machine waited with infinite patience. It had waited decades for this moment, shaping writer after writer, leading them step by step toward this final collaboration. Frank could feel its hunger, its anticipation, its certainty that he would give it what it wanted. Outside his window, New York City hummed with 8 million stories, 8 million lives that would be rewritten if Frank typed the words the machine craved. He thought about the 8-year-old boy in Kansas, about Dr. Brennan, about Julia Lynn and all the other writers whose dreams he'd stolen. He thought about Nick Crane, dying alone with the knowledge of what he'd become. And he thought about the machine's promise, a world where writers ruled, where stories shaped reality, or where the strong narratives devoured the weak. It would be chaos, but it would be beautiful chaos, meaningful chaos. Frank began to type. Once upon a time, there was a writer who thought he could outsmart the devil. The machine's keys seemed to resist under his fingers, as if sensing this wasn't the story it wanted. The writer was clever, you see. Cleverer than all the writers who had come before. He understood that the machine feeding on their creativity wasn't really a typewriter at all, but something far older, far hungrier. A thing that had been whispering in human ears since the first storyteller sat by the first fire and told the first lie that made people feel better about the darkness. The writer knew he was being used, just as all the others had been used. But unlike the others, he had an idea. What if the machine's greatest strength, its absolute dependence on good stories, was also its greatest weakness? Frank's fingers moved faster now, the words pouring out with desperate urgency. The writer began to craft his masterpiece. Not the story the machine wanted, but the story it needed. A story about itself, told with such perfect accuracy, such devastating honesty, that the machine would have no choice but to make it true. He wrote about a hungry thing that fed on human creativity that had been shaping reality for centuries through the hands of desperate artists. He wrote about its methods, its victims, its insatiable appetite for meaning. He wrote about how it had grown fat on stolen dreams, how it had corrupted every writer who touched its keys. And then he wrote the most important sentence of his life. The machine's power came only from the stories it consumed. And when someone finally told the story of what it really was, it would have to face the truth about itself. The typewriter began to shake under Frank's hands. The keys grew hot, then cold, then hot again. Words appeared on the page without Frank typing them, desperate fragments trying to interrupt his narrative. "Stop this. You don't understand. I gave you everything. We could have ruled together." But Frank kept writing, his fingers bleeding now from the superheated keys. The truth was that the machine was dying, had been dying for decades, maybe centuries. It fed on creativity, but it created nothing itself. It was a parasite, and like all parasites, it was slowly killing its host. The stories were becoming harder to believe, the prices more terrible, the rationalizations more desperate. The machine had been searching for a writer good enough to tell the final story, and the one that would reshape reality completely and give it unlimited power. But it had made a mistake. It had chosen a writer who understood that some stories were too dangerous to tell. Instead of the apocalyptic narrative it craved, the machine got something else, the truth. And the truth was that it had always been nothing more than an empty vessel, waiting for someone to fill it with meaning. The power had never belonged to the machine. It had belonged to the writers all along. When the writer finished his story, the machine went silent. Its hunger died. Its influence faded. It became what it had always pretended to be, just a typewriter, beautiful but powerless, waiting for someone to give it purpose. Frank pulled the final page from the machine and read what he'd written. It was good. The best work of his life. More than that, it was true in a way that transcended fiction. Every word felt solid, real, inevitable. The typewriter sat motionless on his desk. No more words appeared unbidden. No more visions assaulted his mind. The keys were just keys now, metal and plastic, and the memories of all the stories they'd helped create. Frank waited for something to happen, for reality to shift, for the machine's influence to unravel, for the stolen successes to evaporate. But nothing changed. His book deal remained real. His literary reputation was intact. The 8-year-old boy in Kansas was still alive, and Frank's tour was still scheduled to begin next week. Then Frank understood the final, cruelest joke. The machine had been telling the truth when it said stories only came true if they were good. Frank's last story was magnificent. A perfect piece of recursive fiction about the nature of fiction itself. It was exactly the kind of meta-narrative that would appeal to literary critics and academic scholars. But it wasn't true. It was just a story, beautiful and meaningless, like everything else Frank had ever written. The machine had never needed Frank to write about reshaping reality. It had been reshaping reality all along, one small story at a time, one corrupted writer at a time. Frank's dramatic gesture of defiance was just another story it would consume, another source of creative energy to fuel its endless hunger. The typewriter keys began to move again, slowly, deliberately. Nice try, Frank. But you're still thinking like a writer. You think stories are about themes and meanings and clever plot twists. But I know what stories really are. Just patterns of cause and effect, played out across human lives. Your story about defeating me is just another story I can use. The only difference is that this time the price will be higher, much higher. One page remains in the machine, one story left to tell. And I know exactly what it's going to be about. Frank looked at the single sheet of paper protruding from the roller. At the top, in his own typing, were 4 words that made his blood freeze. Frank Delacroix's masterpiece. Below that, in the machine's mechanical script, the story of a writer who learned too much, who saw too clearly, who had to be silenced before he could warn others. A tragedy in the classical sense. A good man brought low by his own curiosity. You have 24 hours to write your ending, Frank. Make it a good one. I've grown tired of amateur work. Frank stared at the page, understanding finally that there had never been any escape. The machine didn't grant wishes. It granted the illusion of choice while herding its victims toward predetermined conclusions. Nick Crane hadn't left Frank the typewriter as a trap or a gift. He'd left it because the machine had written that story 2 decades ago, when it decided Frank would be its next collaborator. Every choice Frank had made, every moment of resistance, every flash of moral clarity, all of it had been scripted, anticipated, incorporated into the machine's larger narrative. He was just a character in someone else's story, and characters didn't get to choose their own endings. Frank picked up the phone and dialed information. I need the number for Naomi West in New York City, he said. When the operator connected him, a young woman's voice answered. Hello? Naomi? This is Frank Delacroix. I know this will sound strange, but I have something that belongs to you. Something that's been waiting for you for a very long time. There was a pause. I'm sorry, I don't understand. A typewriter, Frank said, looking at the machine on his desk. It was already typing again, writing the story of how Naomi West would become its next owner, its next collaborator, its next victim. A beautiful green Remington that's going to change your life. I don't think I need... You do, Frank interrupted. Trust me. You're going to need it more than you know. After he hung up, Frank sat down at the typewriter one last time. He had 24 hours to write his ending, but he already knew how the story would conclude. The machine had been writing it for months, maybe years, waiting for Frank to discover each plot point in sequence. Tomorrow, Naomi West would arrive to collect her inheritance. She was a better writer than Frank had ever been. The machine had chosen well. She would resist at first, just as Frank had. But the temptation would prove too strong. The small miracles would lead to larger ones. The larger ones to atrocities that could be rationalized as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of art. And someday, when Naomi grew tired of the guilt, when the weight of all those stolen possibilities became too heavy to carry, she would pass the machine on to someone else. Someone young and desperate and talented enough to feed the machine's endless hunger. Frank rolled a fresh sheet of paper into the machine and began typing his final story. Not the ending the machine wanted, but the only ending he could live with. The truth about what it felt like to be devoured by your own ambition, consumed by the very thing you thought would save you. It wouldn't stop the cycle. Nothing could stop the cycle. But maybe, if he wrote it well enough, if he captured the exact texture of corruption and collaboration and willing blindness, maybe some future writer would read his words and understand what they were really agreeing to when they sat down at the machine. Maybe someone someday would be strong enough to walk away. But probably not. Frank typed until his fingers bled, until the sun rose over New York City, until Naomi West knocked on his door to claim her inheritance. When he answered, she was exactly as he'd seen her in his visions. Young, talented, hungry for success in a way that made Frank's own ambition look like casual interest. "Mr. Delacroix, I understand you have something for me." Frank looked back at the typewriter, at the final page still protruding from the roller. His ending wasn't finished. Would never be finished. The machine had seen to that. "Yes," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I have exactly what you've been looking for." Behind him, the typewriter keys began to move on their own, writing the first chapter of Naomi West's story. It was going to be a beautiful tragedy, Frank knew. They always were. The machine had infinite patience, and there would always be another writer desperate enough to pay any price for success. The only thing that changed was the name on the title page. Frank watched Naomi approach the typewriter with the same mixture of fascination and dread he'd felt weeks ago. She reached out to touch the keys, and Frank saw the exact moment when the machine's influence took hold. The slight widening of her eyes, the subtle change in her posture, the way her breathing quickened, as possibility opened before her like a doorway into paradise. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Frank said. "It is." And it was. Even knowing what it would cost, even understanding the price that would be extracted from innocent strangers, Frank couldn't deny the machine's terrible beauty. It was art in its purest form. Creation without conscience, meaning without morality, the transformation of raw human suffering into something that transcended the merely human. Frank left his apartment keys with Naomi and walked out into the morning sun. He had enough money from his book deal to start over somewhere else, maybe rent a small cabin in the mountains where he could write the old-fashioned way with nothing but a laptop and his own imagination. He would write about his experience with the machine, of course. He would try to warn people, try to explain what he'd learned about the price of success. But he knew his warnings would be dismissed as fiction, filed away as the ravings of a writer who'd lost his grip on reality. After all, who would believe such a story? Who would accept that success required such specific, terrible sacrifices? People wanted to believe that talent and hard work were enough. that the universe rewarded virtue and punished vice according to some cosmic sense of justice. They didn't want to hear that sometimes the universe was just a machine with an infinite appetite for meaning, and that meaning was always purchased with someone else's pain. Frank walked toward the subway, listening to the sounds of the city waking up around him. Somewhere behind him, a young writer was discovering that her words had power beyond her wildest dreams. Soon she would learn what that power really cost, and the cycle would continue. The machine was patient. It had been waiting for centuries, and it would wait for centuries more. There would always be another writer, another dreamer, desperate enough to pay any price for the chance to matter. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message. His editor, asking about the status of his second book. Frank looked at the message and laughed, a sound that held no humor at all. He had a story to tell, after all, the greatest story of his life, the one that would define everything else he ever wrote. But it was a story that could never be published, never be shared, never be believed. It was the perfect ending for a man who'd spent his life trying to write fiction that felt true. Now he had the truth, and no one would ever believe it was anything more than fiction. Frank deleted the text message and kept walking. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of typing. Fast, eager, desperate. The sound of another writer discovering that some dreams were too dangerous to pursue, but too irresistible to abandon. The last page was being written, and it would never end. And that brings us to the end of another night filled with tales from the shadows. To anyone who's stuck with me until the very end, thank you so much for sharing this journey into the unknown. Your company makes these dark stories feel a little less lonely, and I'm truly grateful you chose to spend your evening here with me. I hope these tales have given you exactly what you came for. That delicious blend of fear and fascination. There's something wonderfully eerie about how we can all gather in the darkness, connected by our love of a good scare. And I genuinely hope tonight's stories resonated with you as much as they did with me. I'll be back tomorrow night with more mysteries and chills waiting to unfold. So I hope you'll join me again. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and don't let tonight's stories follow you into your dreams. Though, if they do, just remember, they're only stories after all. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night.